Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a story that's been hiding in plain sight for over a century. You think you know Laura Ingalls Wilder, the prairie girl with the sunbonnet, the cosy log cabins, the family singing by the fireplace, but what if everything you thought you knew was just the beginning? What if the real story, the one Laura spent decades making sure you'd never fully see, was so brutal, so desperate, so impossibly hard that it would shatter every romantic notion you ever had about pioneer life? This is that story. August 30th, 1894. The sun is setting over the Missouri Ozarks, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood orange. A single covered wagon creaks to a stop on a hillside so rocky, so choked with scrub timber and exhausted soil, that no sane person would call it farmland. The man climbing down from the driver's seat moves slowly, his left leg dragging behind him. He's 37 years old, but his body is that of someone 20 years older. Beside him, a woman steps down, 27, her face carved with lines that speak of losses you don't recover from. In the back of the wagon, a 7-year-old girl with dark eyes watches everything silent. Their names are Almanzo, Laura, and Rose Wilder, and in Laura's leather purse, tucked against her ribs like a secret she's terrified to lose, is exactly $100. That's it. That's everything they have left in the world. $100. In 1894, that could buy you 40 acres of Ozark hill land that nobody else wanted, or 71 hours of skilled carpentry work, or 3 months' worth of flour and beans if you stretched it. But what it really represented was this: the difference between starting over one last time and giving up completely. Let me tell you what it took to save that $100. 2 years of Laura sewing dresses for other women in Smet, South Dakota, while Almanzo took whatever work his crippled body would allow. 2 years of living in a rented room, eating the cheapest food they could stomach, wearing clothes until they were more patch than fabric. 2 years of watching other families build lives while they barely survived. And before those 2 years, 7 years of catastrophe so complete, so relentless, that it's a miracle they're still breathing. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Laura stands on that rocky hillside, and the first thing she smells is red clay and timber rot. The air is thick, nothing like the clean, knife-sharp wind of the Dakota prairie. This air has weight to it, moisture that clings to your skin and makes your clothes stick to your back. The trees here are different too. Not the sparse cottonwoods of Dakota, but dense oak and hickory, their branches tangled overhead like a ceiling closing in. Almanzo limps to the edge of what will become their property line. His leg, the one the diphtheria paralysed back in 1888, aches with every step. That disease took more than just his strength. It took his dream of horse ranching. It took the 6 years of Dakota homesteading he'd poured his soul into. It took the future he'd imagined when he married Laura on that August day 9 years ago, when he still believed that hard work and good land were all a man needed. Now, he's staring at 40 acres of rocks and stumps and soil so thin you can see bedrock poking through like bones. This is what $100 buys you when you're desperate. Rose climbs out of the wagon, her legs stiff from 45 days of travel. 45 days sitting in that wagon, watching the landscape change from the flat, endless Dakota prairie to rolling hills, then to these dark, forested mountains. She's 7 years old, and she's never known a permanent home, born in a claim shanty in Dakota, survived the diphtheria that crippled her father, watched her infant brother die, a baby boy whose name her parents never speak, whose grave they left behind in South Dakota, lived through a house fire that took everything they owned, followed her parents to Florida, where the heat and mosquitoes nearly killed them all, then back to South Dakota, then to Minnesota, then back to South Dakota again. 4 attempts at starting over in 7 years. And now this is number 5. Laura unpacks a cast-iron skillet, a sack of cornmeal, and a jar of lard. Tonight they'll camp under the wagon. Tomorrow they'll start figuring out how to turn this hillside into something that doesn't kill them. She doesn't cry. She stopped crying years ago, somewhere between the house fire and the baby's death. In that space where grief becomes so heavy, it turns into something else entirely. Something harder, something that doesn't break. Almanzo builds a small fire as darkness settles over the Ozarks. The wood here burns different than Dakota buffalo chips, hotter, with more smoke. Rose sits close to the flames, her face illuminated in flickering orange light. Nobody speaks. There's nothing to say that hasn't already been said a dozen times before. What they don't know, what they can't possibly know sitting there in the August darkness with $100 and 40 acres of rocks, is that this place will become Rocky Ridge Farm. That 18 years from now, it will be 200 acres of productive land worth $10,000. That Laura will sit in a farmhouse she designed herself and write the books that will make her one of America's most beloved authors. But tonight, they're just three people who've run out of options, staring at a hillside that looks like a punishment. And the only question that matters is this: can they survive long enough to prove everyone wrong? You need to understand something before we go any further. The Wilders didn't arrive in Missouri as optimistic pioneers chasing the American dream. They arrived as survivors of a 9-year catastrophe that would have broken most people 6 different ways. Let's go back. August 25th, 1885. Smet, Dakota Territory. Laura Ingalls, 18 years old, stands in a black cashmere dress. Not white, because white is for people who can afford dresses they'll only wear once. The ceremony is simple. Her parents Charles and Carolyn stand witness. Her sisters watch. And when Reverend Edward Brown reaches the part about obeying your husband, Laura speaks 3 words that will define her entire marriage. I will not say, obey. Not a shout, not a dramatic moment, just a quiet statement of fact, delivered in a voice that could cut glass. Almanzo doesn't argue. Maybe he's smart enough to know that the woman standing before him has a will forged in the same brutal fires that created the Dakota prairie itself. Maybe he just doesn't care about words when the wheat crop is waiting. They drive north to his homestead claim. 320 acres split between a homestead and a tree claim. In 1885, Dakota Territory, that makes Almanzo practically royalty. He's got horses, beautiful Morgan horses named Skip and Barnum that represent more capital than most settlers see in 5 years. He's got a claim shanty measuring 12 feet by 14 feet. He's got tools, seed, and 6 years of farming experience behind him. He believes, genuinely believes, that hard work will overcome any obstacle. This belief is about to be tested in ways that will nearly destroy him. 1885. Drought. The wheat comes up thin and stunted, the heads barely filling with grain. They harvest enough to pay debts and survive the winter, but there's no profit, no money to expand, no cushion for next year. 1886. Drought again. The soil cracks open in patterns like broken pottery. The wheat dies before it reaches full height. On December 5th, in the middle of a Dakota winter, Laura gives birth to a daughter they name Rose. The birth is difficult. The baby is healthy. But now there's another mouth to feed when there's barely enough for 2. 1887, the 3rd year of drought. Almanzo walks through his wheat field in July and watches it die in real time. The hot winds come, superheated air from the southwest that sucks moisture from plants faster than their roots can replace it. He can literally see the wheat turning from green to yellow to brown, hour by hour, as if the land itself is hemorrhaging. They harvest 8 bushels per acre. At current prices, that won't cover the seed cost, but the drought is just the opening act. Winter of 1888. Diphtheria sweeps through Smet like a scythe through wheat. It's a bacterial infection that forms a thick membrane in your throat, choking off your airway. Children die first. Their smaller throats can't handle the obstruction. Then it moves to the adults. Laura gets sick first. For 3 days, she battles fever so high it makes her hallucinate. Her throat swells until breathing becomes a conscious effort, each inhale a small victory. Rose, barely 2 years old, somehow doesn't catch it. But then Almanzo gets sick, and Almanzo doesn't recover. The fever breaks, the membrane clears. He can breathe again. But something else has happened, something the doctors don't fully understand. The diphtheria toxin has attacked his nervous system, damaging the nerves in his legs. When he tries to stand, his left leg won't obey. The muscles fire incorrectly or don't fire at all. He can walk, but only with a limp. He can work, but not for long. The pain is constant, a dull ache that flares into sharp agony with exertion. He's 28 years old, and his body is partially paralysed. For a man whose entire identity is built on physical labour, this is more than injury. It's a kind of death. But wait, we're not done yet. Summer of 1889, Laura is pregnant again. On a hot August day, she gives birth to a son. They don't name him right away. Frontier families often waited to name babies until they were sure the child would survive. This one doesn't. The baby boy lives less than 2 weeks. The exact cause of death isn't recorded. Possibly seizures, possibly an infection, possibly one of a dozen things that killed infants in 1880s. Dakota, when medical care was a doctor you had to ride 12 miles to find, assuming he was sober when you got there. They bury their son in the Smet cemetery. Laura doesn't write about him in her books. Rose barely mentions him in her own writings. He becomes the family member who vanishes from history, acknowledged only in genealogical records and the occasional scholarly footnote. His grave is marked simply, Baby Son Wilder. And then, because apparently the universe isn't finished, the house burns down. Late 1889, a fire starts. Exact cause unknown, possibly a chimney issue, possibly a lamp knocked over. The house Almanzo built, the one they've been slowly improving, goes up like kindling. They escape with their lives and whatever they can grab. Everything else, furniture, clothes, tools, keepsakes, Laura's few books, turns to ash. They're left with nothing. No home, no wheat crop, no savings. A partially paralysed husband, a grieving mother, a 3-year-old daughter, and debts they can't repay. This is when most people would quit. But Laura Ingalls Wilder isn't most people. Spring Valley, Minnesota, 1890. Laura and Almanzo show up at his parents' farm like ghosts returning from a war. James and Angeline Wilder take them in because that's what you do for family. Even when your son has clearly failed at everything he's tried. Almanzo can barely walk some days. The paralysis comes and goes. Some mornings he wakes up and his leg works almost normally. Other days it drags behind him like dead weight. He's supposed to rest, but rest is a luxury for people who aren't drowning in debt and shame. They stay for a year. Laura helps Angeline with housework. Almanzo does what work he can. Rose plays with her cousins. And every single day Laura saves every penny she can scrape together. Because she's already planning the next move. Here's what you need to understand about Laura Ingalls Wilder. She's not a quitter. She's not romantic. She doesn't believe in destiny or fate or divine providence. She believes in work, in calculation, in making decisions based on cold, practical mathematics. And the mathematics in Minnesota are simple. They can't stay here. They can't go back to Dakota. They've already lost that fight. They need land they can afford in a climate Almanzo's body can tolerate, with enough rainfall that they're not gambling everything on weather luck. Someone, probably Almanzo's brother Royal, shows them a promotional pamphlet from the St. Louis and San Francisco Railway. It's advertising land in the Missouri Ozarks, in a region the railroad companies are calling the land of the Big Red Apple. The pamphlet promises cheap land, 3 to 15 per acre, 40 to 45 inches of rain annually, 200 frost-free days for growing, orchards that produce prize-winning fruit, timber for building and fuel, game for hunting. It looks like paradise on paper. Laura reads it with the skepticism of someone who's seen too many promises turn to dust. But here's the thing. They don't need paradise. They need possible. They need a place where Almanzo's bad leg won't be a death sentence, where they can grow enough food to eat and maybe, enough to sell, where the climate won't kill them and the land won't break them. Missouri isn't perfect, but it's a chance. 1891. They try Florida first, because apparently they haven't learned their lesson about believing promotional materials. Some pamphlet or relative or con artist convinces them that Florida is the future. Oranges, warm weather, easy living. They last 1 year. Florida in 1891 is heat, mosquitoes carrying malaria, hurricanes, and soil that grows nothing they know how to farm. Almanzo's leg swells in the humidity. Rose gets sick repeatedly. They're living in someone else's house, trying to grow crops they don't understand, in a climate that feels like punishment. They give up and go back to Smet. 1892 to 1894. These are the saving years. Laura works as a seamstress, making dresses for the few women in Smet who can afford to pay. She charges 50 cents for a simple dress, $1 for something with detail work. Some weeks she makes $3. Some weeks she makes 50 cents. Every penny goes into a jar she keeps hidden. Almanzo takes day labour when he can find it. His reputation as a good horseman still holds, so sometimes farmers hire him to break horses or handle difficult teams. He can't do full farm work anymore, can't walk behind a plough for 12 hours, can't lift 100-pound sacks of grain, but he can do some things, and some income is better than none. Rose goes to school. She's a serious child, quiet, always watching. She's seen her parents lose everything twice. She understands, in the way children of poverty always understand, that money means survival. For 2 years they save. 2 years of living in cheap rented rooms. 2 years of eating beans and cornmeal and whatever vegetables they can beg or trade for. 2 years of wearing the same clothes until they're more patched than original fabric. 2 years of watching other families build lives while they're stuck in place, saving for a gamble that might not pay off. But by summer of 1894 they have $100, and they have a plan. July 17th, 1894. They pack everything they own into a covered wagon. It's not much. A few pieces of furniture, bedding, cook pots, tools, Laura's lap desk with a few pieces of paper and her pen, Almanzo's bridle and harness for the horses, Rose's one doll. They say goodbye to Charles and Caroline Ingalls. This might be the last time they see each other. Travel isn't casual when you're poor, and Missouri is 650 miles away. Charles is 58 now, his dark hair greying, his back bent from decades of hard labour that never quite paid off. Caroline is 55, still keeping her house spotless, still pretending that poverty is just a temporary inconvenience. Neither parent tells them not to go. What would be the point? The Wilders have already lost everything twice. One more try won't make the failure any worse. The journey takes 45 days, 650 miles at roughly 15 miles per day, accounting for weather delays and the need to rest the horses. They follow emigrant trails south through Nebraska, into Kansas, then southeast into Missouri. Laura keeps a diary of the journey, though only fragments survive in published form. She notes the changing landscape, the flat Dakota prairie giving way to rolling hills, then to the dense forests of the Ozarks. She describes the weather, the condition of the roads, the small towns they pass through. She records expenses in precise detail, 50 cents for hay, 20 cents for cornmeal, 5 cents for a newspaper. What she doesn't record is the fear, the constant gnawing anxiety that they're making another mistake, that Missouri will be just another Florida, another Dakota, another place where they'll lose everything and have to start over with even less. But on August 30th, 1894, when they finally arrive at the 40-acre hillside that will become Rocky Ridge Farm, Laura steps down from the wagon, looks at the rocky, timber-choked land and makes a decision. This is where they stop running. This is where they build or die, trying. September 1st, 1894. The sun is barely above the horizon when Laura steps out of the wagon and plants her feet on Ozark soil for the first time as an owner, not a visitor. The word feels strange in her mouth. Owner. As if 40 acres of rocks and timber and exhausted earth can be owned the way you own a dress or a cooking pot. As if signing papers in a lawyer's office somehow transforms wilderness into property. She's 27 years old. She's been married for 9 years, and in those 9 years she's learned that ownership is a lie people tell themselves to feel secure. You don't own land. You just occupy it temporarily until something, drought, fire, disease, debt, takes it away from you. But this is what they have, so this is what they'll make work. The 40 acres stretch before her in a way that makes Dakota's flat horizons feel almost comforting by comparison. There are no clean sight lines here, no ability to see danger coming from miles away. The land rolls and dips, carved by ancient water into ridges and valleys that create pockets of shadow even at midday. Oak trees, massive, old, their trunks wider than Laura can wrap her arms around, dominate the high ground. Hickory fills the spaces between, and everywhere, coating the ground like a plague, are rocks. Not the occasional stone you can kick aside, not the manageable field stones Dakota farmers stack into boundary markers. These are limestone chunks the size of a child's head, sometimes larger, embedded in soil so thin you can see bedrock poking through in places. Laura walks 20 paces and counts 37 rocks. She walks another 20 paces and stops counting because the mathematics are too depressing. This is what $100 buys when you're desperate. This is what America offers when you've already failed everywhere else. Almanzo limps beside her, his cane sinking into the leaf litter with each step. He's quiet, has been quiet since they arrived yesterday, since they saw what their money actually purchased. Laura watches him calculate, same as she's calculating. How many rocks can one partially paralysed man and one exhausted woman move in a day? How many trees can they cut with a handsaw? How long before this forest becomes something resembling farmland? The answer to all these questions is the same, longer than they can probably afford, but they're here. The deed is signed. The $300 mortgage sits in Freeman's office like a patient predator, waiting to consume them if they miss a single payment. There's no going back to Smet. That door closed the moment they spent their last $5 on bacon and flour in Springfield. There's no moving on to somewhere else, because somewhere else requires resources they've already spent. Missouri is it. This hillside is it. These 40 acres of rocks and timber and uncertainty are the last chapter of their story. It either works, or they die trying. Rose interrupts Laura's calculations by asking the questions 7-year-olds ask when the world looks nothing like what they expected. Where's the house? Laura turns to her daughter. Rose is dusty from 2 weeks of wagon travel, her dress stained with mud from yesterday's rain, her dark hair escaping the braids Laura repaired this morning. She's thin, has been thin since Florida, since the year of separations and sickness, but her eyes are sharp, alert, already learning to read situations the way children of poverty learn to read situations, calculating safety and danger before adults have finished speaking. There isn't a house yet, Laura says, keeping her voice level. Matter of fact, not scared, never scared. We're going to build one. Rose looks at the dense timber, the rocks, the absence of anything resembling civilization, and processes this information with the seriousness of someone who's watched her parents fail before. How long will that take? A while, Almanzo says. His voice is rough. From disuse, from exhaustion, from the weight of being a man whose body can't perform the labour his pride demands. We'll camp in the wagon until we get something built. It'll be an adventure. Adventure. That's what you call poverty and uncertainty when you're trying to keep a child from panicking. Laura learned that lesson from her own father, who turned every disaster into a story, every crisis into an opportunity. Except Charles Ingalls never actually fixed anything. He just moved on to the next failure with optimism that felt less like courage and more like pathology. Laura won't repeat that pattern. She won't lie to her daughter about how hard this will be. But she also won't let Rose see the fear that's sitting in her chest like a stone. First thing, Laura says, speaking to both Almanzo and Rose, we need water. The spring they saw yesterday, the reason they chose this particular 40 acres, sits in a ravine about 200 yards from where they're standing. It's reliable, Freeman assured them. Flows year-round, never goes dry even in the worst droughts. Whether Freeman is telling the truth, or whether he's just another con man in a long line of con men selling worthless land to desperate people, remains to be seen. But water is survival. Everything else, shelter, food, clearing the land, planting crops, depends on having reliable water, so that's where they start. Laura picks up 2 buckets from the wagon, hands one to Rose. keeps one for herself. Almanzo opens his mouth to object, to suggest that he should be the one hauling water, that this is men's work, but Laura cuts him off with a look that's become familiar over 9 years of marriage. His legs barely support his own weight. They certainly can't handle carrying 40 pounds of water up a hillside. That's just mathematics, not judgment. So Laura and Rose walk to the spring while Almanzo begins sorting through their possessions, taking inventory of what survived the journey. 2 weeks in a covered wagon damages things, breaks things, tests every seal and joint and seam until weaknesses reveal themselves. The spring is cold, shockingly cold, even in September heat. Laura fills the buckets, and the water is so clear she can see individual grains of sand on the bottom. It tastes mineral heavy but clean. Not the alkaline tang of Dakota well water, not the sulfur smell of Florida swamp water, just clean Missouri spring water that's been filtering through limestone for millennia. Rose drinks until her stomach bulges. Laura drinks more carefully, rationing, already calculating how many trips they'll need to make daily. Cooking water, drinking water, washing water, water for the horses, the mathematics of survival on a forested hillside with no well, no pump, no infrastructure except what they build with their own hands. They carry the full buckets back up the ravine. Laura's arms burn by the time they reach the wagon. Rose is struggling, slopping water over the sides of her bucket, but she doesn't complain. 7 years old and already understanding that complaining changes nothing. Almanzo has sorted their possessions into categories. Tools here, cookware there, bedding piled separately. Food stores, pitifully small, maybe 2 weeks' worth if they're careful, covered with canvas to protect from weather. Everything they own, laid out in the September sun, looking even more inadequate than it felt in the wagon. We need shelter before winter, Almanzo says. Not to Laura specifically, just stating fact. Thinking out loud, processing the same calculations Laura's been running since they arrived. Winter in Missouri isn't Dakota winter. Freeman promised that repeatedly. No 40 below cold snaps. No blizzards that kill livestock in hours. But winter is still winter. Freezing temperatures, rain that turns to ice, the kind of damp cold that penetrates walls and settles into your bones. They have maybe 10 weeks before hard frost. 10 weeks to build something weatherproof. 10 weeks while simultaneously clearing land, establishing a garden, finding some source of income because the mortgage payment comes due whether they're ready or not. Laura looks at the trees, looks at the rocks, looks at her husband leaning on his cane and her daughter sitting in the wagon bed, swinging her legs and singing to herself. 10 weeks. They'd better get started. Timber. That's the first problem and the first resource. They need wood for shelter, but the trees that need cutting are the same trees providing the only asset this land possesses. Oak and hickory, hardwoods that resist the saw, that fight every stroke, that make a man's arms burn after 20 minutes of work. Almanzo can't do it. Not sustained cutting. His legs won't support the stance required for working a crosscut saw. His hands shake after prolonged gripping. He can manage maybe 15 minutes before his body simply refuses to cooperate. Which means Laura does it. She's never cut timber, never held a saw designed for 2 men working in rhythm, never stood in front of a tree trunk 3 feet in diameter and calculated angles and fall patterns and the 1,000 ways this can go catastrophically wrong. But she learns, because learning is survival, and survival is the only available option. The saw Freeman sold them, sold, not gave, because nothing in Mansfield comes free, is a 6-foot crosscut saw with teeth that look designed to bite more than wood. It's built for 2-person operation. One pulls while the other guides, alternating in rhythm that makes the work almost bearable. Almost. Laura and Almanzo try working it together the first morning. He stands on one side of a mid-sized oak they've selected for cutting. She stands opposite. They pull in alternation, the saw blade disappearing into bark, into heartwood, into the tree's centre where decades of growth rings mark time in ways humans can't perceive. It works for 10 minutes. Then Almanzo's right leg buckles. He catches himself on his cane, breath coming hard, sweat running down his face despite the cool September morning. He doesn't apologise, doesn't explain. just steps back and lets Laura know without words that this isn't going to work. So Laura cuts alone. You can operate a crosscut saw solo if you're desperate enough and stubborn enough and willing to accept that it'll take 3 times as long as proper 2-person work. You wedge one end against the cut, then pull from the other side, using your body weight to force the blade through resistant wood. Then you reverse, wedge the opposite end, pull again, back and forth, over and over, until your shoulders scream and your hands blister, and the tree finally shudders and cracks and falls with a sound like thunder. The first tree takes Laura 6 hours. 6 hours of pulling and resting and pulling again, stopping only when her vision starts to blur from exhaustion. When it finally falls, crashes through smaller trees, shakes the ground hard enough that she feels it through her boots, she sits down on the stump and cries. Not from pain, not from exhaustion, from the mathematics. If one tree takes 6 hours, and they need timber for a cabin approximately 16 feet by 12 feet, and that requires maybe 30 logs minimum, then she's looking at 180 hours of sawing, plus trimming branches, plus moving the logs, plus notching and stacking and chinking. 180 hours divided by 8-hour work days equals 22 days. Except she can't work 8 hours straight cutting timber, because she also needs to cook, haul water, care for Rose, maintain the camp, and rest enough to avoid collapse. Call it a month, minimum, before they have walls. Add another week for a roof. Factor in weather delays, mistakes, the learning curve of someone who's never built anything larger than a chicken coop. They're looking at 6 weeks before they have shelter. 6 weeks sleeping in the wagon. 6 weeks exposed to weather and animals and the reality that Missouri isn't as safe as Freeman's office made it sound. Almanzo understands these calculations without Laura speaking them aloud. He watches her sit on that stump, watches her wipe her eyes and stand up and approach the next tree, and something shifts in his expression. Not guilt. Guilt is useless and they both know it. But acknowledgement. Understanding that their roles have inverted in ways neither of them imagined on that August day 9 years ago, when they stood in Reverend Brown's parlour promising to face the future together. He can't be the provider. His body simply won't allow it. So Laura will be, and he'll contribute what he can. Planning, lighter work, caring for Rose when Laura is cutting timber, and they'll survive not through the gender roles society expects, but through the pragmatic division of labour that disability and circumstance demand. That night, camped in the wagon, Rose asks the question she's been holding since morning. "Mama, why are you doing the man work?" Laura is exhausted. Her hands are blistered despite the gloves. Her shoulders ache in ways that make lifting the spoon to eat her evening cornmeal feel like climbing a mountain. She could say, because someone has to. Could say, because your father's legs don't work right. Could say, because this is what survival looks like when the world doesn't match the stories. Instead, she says, because it needs doing, and I'm the one who can do it. Rose thinks about this, processes it with her 7-year-old logic that's already more sophisticated than most adults will ever achieve. Finally, she nods. "Can I help?" "Yes," Laura says. "Tomorrow you can help." And she means it, because 7-year-old labour is still labour. Because even small hands can carry small branches, can fetch tools, can free up minutes in Laura's day that might mean the difference between finishing before winter and freezing to death in a half-built cabin. The next morning they start again. Laura cuts. Almanzo plans and measures and does what limited physical work his body allows. Rose carries branches and stacks them for kindling, and learns that survival is a family endeavour where everyone contributes whatever they can. By the end of September, they've felled 8 trees. 8 trees in 4 weeks. The mathematics are still brutal, but they're improving. Laura is learning to read wood grain, to position cuts more efficiently, to use gravity and wind direction to make the trees fall where she wants, instead of where physics randomly decides. The 8 felled trees lie scattered across their 40 acres like fallen soldiers. Their bark is scarred and stripped in places where Laura's saw slipped or caught. Their branches reach toward the sky like they're still trying to grow, still refusing to acknowledge that their life as vertical beings has ended. Almanzo begins the process of converting trees into logs. This work he can do, mostly. It requires planning and precision more than raw strength. He uses a smaller saw to remove branches, then marks each trunk with measurements for cutting. 16-foot lengths for the long walls, 12-foot for the short walls. Every cut planned to minimise waste, because waste is a luxury they can't afford. Rose helps by dragging branches to a clearing where they'll dry for firewood. It's light work, appropriate for a child, but it matters. Every branch she moves is one Laura doesn't have to move later. Every minute saved accumulates into hours, into days, into the margin between survival and disaster. October brings the first real test. Not winter yet, but cold enough that sleeping in the wagon becomes uncomfortable. Not freezing, but temperatures in the 30s at night that make Laura wake with stiff joints and lungs that ache from breathing cold air for 8 hours. They've cut 17 trees now, converted them into 38 usable logs. It's not enough for a complete cabin, but it's enough to start building. And building means commitment. It means they're not just camping on this land, they're actually attempting to live here. The cabin site is on high ground, about 50 yards from where they've been parking the wagon. Almanzo chose it for drainage and visibility. Water runs downhill away from the structure, and they can see anyone approaching from the dirt road a quarter-mile away. It's pragmatic positioning that reflects military thinking more than farming logic. The kind of choice a man makes when he's learned that frontier threats come from weather, animals, and occasionally people who think desperation makes you vulnerable. They start with a foundation. In Dakota, this would mean digging below the frost line, pouring stone footings, creating permanent stability. In Missouri, where the ground barely freezes and stone is abundant, it means selecting the flattest section of ground and laying limestone chunks in a rough rectangle 16 feet by 12 feet. This is Rose's work, mostly. She's strong for 7, and moving rocks 20 pounds or less doesn't require adult strength, just persistence. She works alongside Laura, who moves the larger stones, 50, 60 pounds each, into position, while Almanzo directs placement and checks for level using a string and weight method that's been measuring accuracy since the pyramids. The foundation takes 3 days. When it's finished, they have a rough rectangle of stacked limestone that's level enough for building and stable enough to support log walls. It's not pretty. But pretty is for people who aren't trying to survive winter in a wagon. The first wall goes up on October 15th. Laura and Almanzo work together on this, her providing strength, him providing technical knowledge of notching and fit. The logs are heavy, maybe 200 pounds each, requiring both of them to lift and position. Almanzo can't support full weight with his legs, but he can guide and stabilise while Laura does the primary lifting. It's dangerous work. A log that slips can break ribs, crush feet, kill if it catches you wrong. They work slowly, carefully, checking every placement before committing. By sunset, they've stacked 3 logs high. By week's end, the wall reaches 6 feet, high enough that it's starting to resemble shelter instead of random timber arrangement. But they're running out of time, and running out of food. The supplies they brought from Smet are nearly gone. The cornmeal is down to maybe 5 pounds. The bacon they bought in Springfield is finished. The flour has a week left, maximum. They have coffee beans but no sugar. They have lard but no butter. The pantry of a cabin that doesn't exist yet is already bare. This is the crisis Laura knew was coming but couldn't prevent. You can't build shelter and earn income simultaneously. The mathematics don't allow it. Every hour spent cutting timber is an hour not spent earning money. Every day constructing walls is a day without wages. They knew this when they started. Knew they were gambling that they could build fast enough to avoid freezing or starving. They're losing the gamble. On October 23rd, with walls half finished and the first frost silvering the ground at dawn, Laura makes a decision that she hates but can't avoid. She's going to Mansfield to find work. Almanzo wants to argue, wants to suggest he's the one who should go to town seeking employment, but they both know that's fantasy. His carpentry skills are good, but his body is unreliable. He can work for short periods, then needs rest. He requires a cane to walk any distance. And construction work, the only employment readily available to men in Mansfield, demands sustained physical labour his disability simply won't permit. Laura, on the other hand, can sew, can cook, can clean houses or take in laundry, or do any of the dozen domestic tasks that town women pay other women to perform. It's not high-wage work, but it's available work, and availability matters more than pride when you're calculating whether you eat this week. She walks to Mansfield at dawn on October 24th. The distance is roughly 1 mile, which doesn't sound like much until you're walking it on an empty stomach carrying nothing but determination and the fear that you won't find anything. Mansfield in 1894 is a town of maybe 400 people. It has a main street with businesses, mercantile, hardware store, bank, hotel, and a few houses that constitute the residential area. It's small enough that everyone knows everyone else's business within a day, which means everyone in Mansfield knows the Yankees who bought the Newton land are here and struggling. Laura goes to the hotel first, asks the proprietor, a woman named Mrs. Cooley, whose expression combines curiosity and skepticism whether they need help with cooking or cleaning. Mrs. Cooley looks Laura over with the assessment women give other women when calculating trustworthiness and competence. "Where you from?" she asks, though she obviously knows. "South Dakota," Laura says, not elaborating, not explaining the 9 years of failure that brought her here. "I can cook, clean, sew, whatever you need." Mrs. Cooley considers. "I got a girl who does most of the work, but she's been wanting Sunday off. You could come Sundays, 6 in the morning to 6 at night. Cooking, serving, cleaning after meals. 50 cents. 50 cents. For 12 hours of work. That's about 4 cents per hour, which is exploitative even by 1894 standards. But Laura needs 50 cents more than she needs dignity, so she nods. "I'll be here Sunday." She spends the rest of the day knocking on doors asking after sewing work. 2 women have dresses they need altered. 1 man needs shirts mended. The pay is minimal, 25 cents per dress, 10 cents per shirt, but it's income, and income means food. By the time Laura walks back to the cabin site at dusk, she's secured approximately $2 worth of work. $2 that will buy flour, cornmeal, maybe a little bacon. $2 that means they won't starve this week. Almanzo and Rose have continued building in her absence. They've added another 2 logs to the walls. Slow progress, but progress nonetheless. Rose has collected a pile of firewood that's tall as she is, and Almanzo has constructed a makeshift roof over the wagon, using canvas and branches, creating slightly better shelter until the cabin is finished. They eat a sparse supper, cornbread made from the last of the cornmeal water, nothing else, and don't talk about how hungry they still are after finishing. Hunger is the new normal. Hunger is what you accept when you're building something from nothing. That night, sleeping in the wagon with Rose between them, Laura lies awake calculating. If she works Sundays at the hotel and brings in 50 cents per week, plus occasional sewing work worth maybe 25 cents per week, that's $3 per month. The cabin needs to be finished within 4 weeks, or they're sleeping in a wagon through Missouri winter, which is survivable but miserable. The mortgage payment of $25 comes due in February, 4 months away, which feels both impossibly distant and terrifyingly close. They need more income. They need the cabin finished. They need to clear land for spring planting. They need about 4 more hours in each day and resources they don't possess. But what they have is this: 40 acres, a half-built cabin, each other, and the absolute certainty that surrender isn't an option, because there's nowhere left to surrender to. Missouri is it. This hillside is it. This cabin they're building log by painful log is either their salvation or their grave, and they won't know which until they're finished. So they'll keep building, keep working, keep calculating how to stretch flour and hope into something resembling survival. Because that's what you do when giving up means dying. You wake up the next morning, you move the next log, you take the next sewing job, you haul the next bucket of water, you survive 1 more day, and then another, and then another. Until somehow, impossibly, survival becomes life. Until somehow, impossibly, survival becomes life. And sometimes, if you're stubborn enough, and lucky enough, and willing to bet everything on a gamble that won't pay off for 7 years, survival becomes something more. November 1894. The cabin is finished enough to move into. 4 walls, a roof that mostly doesn't leak, a door that closes. 1 room, 16 feet by 12 feet, with a stone fireplace Almanzo built using rocks Laura cleared from what will someday be a field, is not much. But it's more than they had in August, and infinitely more than they had in Dakota after the house burned. Rose moves her few possessions into the cabin, a doll, 2 dresses, a book, and claims the corner by the window as hers. Laura and Almanzo take the opposite corner. Between them is the table, the stove, the pantry shelf that's mostly empty, and the future they're trying to build from nothing. That first night in the cabin, Laura lies awake listening to sounds that aren't Dakota sounds. No wind through endless grass, no coyotes yipping in the distance. Instead, there's the rustle of leaves, the crack of branches settling in the cold, the occasional scream of a barn owl hunting. Missouri sounds, Ozark sounds, the sounds of a place that's theirs, for better or worse. The next morning Almanzo makes an announcement that will determine everything that follows. We're not planting wheat. Laura stops stirring the cornmeal mush. Rose looks up from the primer she's studying for school. They both wait for him to continue. We tried wheat in Dakota for 6 years, Almanzo says. His voice is quiet but certain. 6 years of gambling everything on one crop. 6 years of watching weather destroy us. I won't do that again. He unfolds a catalogue that arrived last week from Stark Brothers Nursery in Louisiana, Missouri, about 80 miles northeast of Mansfield. The catalogue is thick, printed on good paper, filled with illustrations of fruit trees and glowing descriptions of yields and profits. It's the kind of publication that makes farmers dream and creditors rich. Apple trees, Almanzo says, tapping the page. We plant apples. Laura moves closer to look. The catalogue shows orchards in full fruit, branches heavy with perfect red apples, farmers standing beside wagons loaded with barrels. It looks like prosperity. It looks like safety. It looks like every other promise that's been made to farmers since the Homestead Act passed 30 years ago. How long before they bear fruit, she asks, because she's learned to ask the questions that determine whether you eat or starve. Almanzo hesitates. 7 years. 7 years. Laura does the mathematics instantly. Rose will be 14. Laura will be 34. Almanzo will be 44. 7 years during which they'll need to eat, need to pay the mortgage, need to survive on land that produces nothing except whatever they can scratch out of gardens and small livestock operations. 7 years is an eternity when you're calculating survival week by week. What do we do until then? Laura asks. We diversify, Almanzo says, and there's something in his tone that suggests he's been thinking about this for weeks, maybe months. Dairy cow for butter and cream, chickens for eggs, vegetables. We sell what we don't eat. We work off farm when we need cash, and we plant those apple trees and wait. It's the opposite of Dakota. Dakota was wheat or nothing. All your capital in seed. All your hope in one crop. All your survival dependent on weather cooperating for exactly the right 3 months of the year. This is something different. This is spreading risk across multiple income sources. This is building slowly instead of gambling everything on one harvest. This is admitting that Almanzo's disability means he can't do the brutal single-crop labour that wheat demands. It's also terrifying. Because 7 years of delayed payoff means 7 years of vulnerability. 7 years during which a drought, a disease, a bad market, or simple bad luck could destroy everything before the apples ever bear fruit. But Laura looks at the cabin they've built, looks at the rocks they've cleared, looks at her husband whose body won't let him farm the way he did in Dakota, and she understands that this isn't just an agricultural strategy, it's an adaptation to reality. How much do the trees cost, she asks. Almanzo shows her the pricing. Apple trees are sold by the dozen, the 100, or the 1,000. For a proper commercial orchard of 24 acres, which is about what they can reasonably plant and maintain, they'll need approximately 1,000 trees. The cost is substantial, but Stark Brothers offers payment plans. You can buy on credit and pay over multiple years, betting that future profits will cover current debt. It's another gamble, another debt, another calculation that could go catastrophically wrong. Laura thinks about the baby boy buried into Smet, thinks about the house that burned, thinks about the wheat fields that dried up and blew away. She thinks about all the ways they've already failed, and all the reasons this could fail too. Then she thinks about Rose, who's 8 years old and watching her parents decide whether to risk everything one more time. "When do we order the trees?" Laura asks. Almanzo's face changes. Not quite a smile, but something close to hope. Spring planting season, March or April of 1895. They'll ship from the nursery when the trees are dormant, and we plant as soon as the ground thaws. "Then we'd better start clearing more land," Laura says. Because that's the thing about 7-year gambles. You can't wait until you're ready. You can't wait until you're sure. You can't wait until the conditions are perfect. You start now, with what you have, and you work every single day for 7 years, and at the end, maybe, possibly if you're lucky, you get to eat. Or you don't, and you lose everything. Again. But Laura Ingalls Wilder isn't afraid of losing anymore. She's already lost so much that one more failure barely registers as a possibility worth worrying about. What terrifies her isn't losing. It's never trying. It's settling for survival when something better might be achievable if she's willing to work for it. So they'll plant the apple trees, and they'll wait 7 years. And they'll see what happens. Spring 1895 arrives with the kind of weather that makes Missouri seem like paradise compared to Dakota. No blizzards in April, no frost-killing seedlings in May, just steady warming, reliable rain, and soil that actually wants to grow things. The Stark Brothers catalogue arrives in March with their order confirmation. 1,000 apple trees, primarily Ben Davis variety with some Missouri pippins mixed in. Ben Davis apples aren't the best tasting. They're known for being mediocre in flavour, but exceptional in storage and shipping durability. They're commercial apples, not eating apples. The kind of fruit you grow when you need reliable income more than you need culinary excellence. The trees arrive in early April, shipped by rail to Mansfield, and hauled by wagon to Rocky Ridge Farm. They come bundled in damp burlap, roots wrapped to prevent drying, each bundle tagged with variety and planting instructions. 1,000 bare root saplings, each one may be 4 feet tall, each one representing a bet on the future. Almanzo has spent the winter planning the orchard layout with the precision of an engineer. 25 feet between trees within rows, 32 feet between rows. This spacing allows enough room for mature trees to develop full canopies without crowding, and leaves space for cultivation between rows until the trees reach bearing age. The planting begins on April 15th. Laura and Almanzo work together, her digging the holes, him positioning the trees and backfilling soil. Each hole must be deep enough to accommodate the root system without bending or crowding. Each tree must be planted at the correct depth. Too shallow, and it dries out. Too deep, and it suffocates. Each placement must align with the layout Almanzo marked using stakes and string. It's slow work. On a good day, they plant 30 trees. On a difficult day, when the rocky soil fights every shovel stroke, they manage 15. Rose helps by carrying water buckets from the spring to water in each newly planted tree. She's 8 years old and small for her age, but she's learning that survival requires everyone contributing what they can. By mid-May, the orchard is planted. 1,000 apple trees, arranged in precise rows across 24 acres of what used to be dense forest. The trees look impossibly small against the cleared land. Tiny sticks poking out of raw earth, barely visible from a distance. But Almanzo walks the rows with the expression of a man who's built something significant. Because he has. This orchard represents the largest capital investment they've ever made, the longest-term plan they've ever committed to, and the clearest statement they've ever issued that they intend to stay. While the apple trees grow at the pace nature demands, which is to say slowly, the Wilders must eat. Which means developing the other income streams that will sustain them through the 7-year wait. Laura starts with chickens, 5 hens and a rooster, purchased from a Mansfield farmer for $2. She builds a crude coop using scrap lumber left over from cabin construction and establishes a routine of feeding, watering and collecting eggs that will define her days for the next 2 decades. The chickens are Leghorns, an Italian breed known for exceptional egg production rather than meat. They're small, nervous birds with white feathers, and an attitude that suggests they resent captivity. But they lay consistently, producing 5 to 6 eggs per day once they reach full production. At 10 cents per dozen, Laura can earn maybe 25 cents per week from egg sales in Mansfield. 25 cents per week is $4 per month. It's not prosperity. But it's reliable income that doesn't depend on weather, doesn't require Almanzo's limited physical capacity, and accumulates week after week into money that pays for flour and cornmeal and the occasional piece of bacon. The dairy operation begins in summer of 1895 when they purchase a Jersey cow, a breed chosen for high butterfat content in the milk, which means more cream for butter making. The cow costs $18, which is a staggering sum when your weekly income from eggs is 25 cents. But Almanzo borrows the money from a Mansfield merchant, betting that butter sales will generate enough profit to repay the loan and provide ongoing income. Laura names the cow Fawn, a rare moment of sentimentality in a life defined by pragmatism. She milks Fawn twice daily, morning and evening, extracting roughly 2 gallons of milk per day. The cream separates naturally overnight, rising to the top where Laura skims it off and churns it into butter, using a wooden churn that belonged to Almanzo's mother. 1 pound of butter sells for 15 cents in Mansfield. Laura produces 3 to 4 pounds per week, generating 45 to 60 cents in weekly income. Combined with egg sales, she's bringing in 70 to 85 cents per week, enough to cover basic food costs if they're careful. This is Laura's work now. The chickens, the cow, the butter and eggs. While Almanzo manages the orchard and does what farm work his body allows, Laura runs what amounts to a cottage industry in dairy and poultry products. It's not the life she imagined when she married him. But it's the life that's keeping them alive. The garden is Rose's education. Every afternoon after school, she works alongside her mother, learning to plant, weed and harvest the vegetables that supplement their diet. Potatoes, beans, squash, cabbage, turnips, greens, the pragmatic crops that grow well in Ozark soil and store through winter. Rose is 9 years old and already understands that hunger is prevented through daily labour, that food appears because someone worked to make it appear, that comfort is earned rather than given. She'll carry these lessons into adulthood, where they'll shape her into someone who values self-sufficiency above almost everything else. But that's decades away. Right now, she's just a child, digging potatoes and carrying water and watching her parents work themselves to exhaustion every single day for 7 years, waiting for apple trees to bear fruit. 1896. The apple trees survived their first winter. This is success. Not profit, not productivity, just survival, which is the first hurdle in any agricultural venture. The trees leaf out in spring, develop through summer, go dormant in fall. They grow maybe 12 inches. They produce exactly 0 apples. The Wilder's orchard investment generates 0 income while requiring ongoing labour for cultivation and pest management. Laura increases the chicken flock to 20 hens. Egg production rises to $2 per week. She's becoming known in Mansfield as reliable. Her eggs are consistently fresh. Her butter consistently high quality. Customers begin seeking her out specifically, which means she can occasionally charge a premium. An extra 2 cents per pound of butter doesn't sound significant until you multiply it by 52 weeks. 1897. The apple trees are now 3 years old. Still no fruit. Some are reaching 8 feet in height, developing the branch structure that will eventually support heavy crops. But eventually is a word that doesn't buy flour or pay mortgage interest. Almanzo begins hauling manure from the Mansfield livery stable to fertilise the orchard. This is work he can do. His leg is stable enough for driving a wagon, and shoveling manure doesn't require the sustained heavy labour that would break him. He makes the 5-mile round trip twice a week, bringing back loads of horse manure mixed with straw that he spreads between the tree rows. It's unglamorous work. It smells terrible. It's slow and repetitive, and offers no immediate visible reward. But Almanzo knows that soil fertility will determine yield, and yield will determine whether this 7-year gamble pays off or bankrupts them. So he hauls manure, week after week, month after month, year after year. Laura adds turkeys to the farm operation. Turkeys are more difficult than chickens. They require more space, they're susceptible to more diseases, and they're significantly stupider. But they sell for 60 cents each at Thanksgiving, which is substantial income if you can successfully raise them to market weight. She starts with 6 turkey poults, purchased in spring. By Thanksgiving, she's lost 2 to predators and 1 to disease. The remaining 3 sell for $1.80 total. Subtract the cost of feed and initial purchase, and she's netted maybe 75 cents for 8 months of work. But 75 cents is 75 cents. And next year, with experience, she'll lose fewer birds. This is how you build expertise. Through failure that costs money you can't afford to lose. Through learning what kills turkeys so you can prevent it next time. Through the slow accumulation of knowledge that eventually becomes economic advantage. 1898. The apple trees are 4 years old, roughly halfway to bearing age. The Wilders have been in Missouri for 4 years. They've cleared maybe 15 acres of the original 40. They've built a cabin and are planning a larger house. They owe money to the merchant, money to Stark Brothers, and have mortgage payments that come due with merciless regularity. Laura is now managing 40 chickens, 1 cow, and a growing turkey operation. Her weekly income from eggs and butter averages $1.25. This is significant money, enough that she can occasionally buy fabric for dresses instead of making do with clothes mended beyond recognition. Almanzo has expanded the orchard cultivation by planting vegetables between the tree rows. This serves multiple purposes, generates food for the family, generates small amounts of saleable produce, and utilizes the space that's currently wasted between immature trees. He plants corn, beans, squash, crops that don't compete significantly with the apple tree's root systems and provide food while they wait for the orchard to mature. It's during this year that they begin construction on the frame house that will replace the log cabin. The house is modest, 4 or 5 rooms built gradually as money and lumber become available. It's not the permanent farmhouse Laura designs later. It's a transitional structure that represents progress, that signals they're moving beyond mere survival towards something resembling stability. The construction takes most of a year because they can only build when they have spare cash for materials. Almanzo does the carpentry work which his disability allows. It's precise work requiring skill rather than brute strength. Local carpenters help with the framing, probably working for a combination of cash and trade. By winter of 1898, the house is complete enough to move into. It's warmer than the cabin, larger, more permanent. It feels like progress. 1899, 5 years into the 7-year wait. The apple trees are visibly maturing now, 12 to 15 feet tall, branches spreading, bark thickening. Some are starting to produce a few test blooms in spring, though Almanzo picks these off to prevent fruiting. Young trees that bear fruit too early exhaust themselves and develop poorly. Better to sacrifice this year's handful of apples to ensure abundant production once the trees fully mature. Laura's poultry operation is now substantial. 50 chickens, a regular turkey flock of 15 to 20 birds. She's keeping meticulous records, which hens lay most consistently, which bloodlines produce the healthiest chicks, which feed ratios generate the best production at lowest cost. She's becoming an expert through necessity and obsessive observation. This expertise will eventually make her famous, or at least regionally known. In a dozen years, she'll write articles for the Missouri Ruralist detailing her poultry methods, sharing knowledge with farm families across Missouri. But that's future. Right now, she's just a woman counting eggs and calculating whether she can afford sugar this week. The financial situation is slowly improving. They're no longer in immediate danger of losing the farm. The mortgage is being paid. They're eating adequately, if not abundantly. Rose is growing up healthy, attending school regularly, demonstrating academic aptitude that suggests she might have opportunities beyond farm labour. But they're not prosperous, not secure. They're still one disaster away from catastrophe, one bad illness, one serious injury, one economic depression that collapses agricultural prices. They're survivors, not thrivers. And the apple trees that represent their best chance at actually getting ahead are still 2 years away from bearing fruit. 1900, 6 years since planting. The apple trees bloom in spring, not tentatively but exuberantly. White blossoms cover the branches, transforming the orchard into something that looks almost magical. Bees work the flowers. The air smells like spring and promise and the faint possibility that maybe, just maybe, this gamble is going to pay off. Almanzo lets some of the fruit set, not all of it. Because the trees still aren't fully mature, but enough to produce a small crop. By fall, they harvest approximately 50 bushels of apples. It's not a commercial quantity, but it's proof that the trees are viable, proof that the variety Stark Brothers sold them will produce in Missouri soil, proof that 7 years of waiting wasn't completely insane. They eat some of the apples fresh. Laura makes applesauce and apple butter. They sell a few bushels locally, and they wait 1 more year for the trees to reach full bearing age. 1901, 1902, 7 years since planting. The apple trees are mature. The orchard blooms heavily in spring. The fruit sets well. Through summer, the apples grow, swell, ripen. By September, the branches are heavy with fruit, red and yellow globes that represent 7 years of labour. 7 years of faith, 7 years of betting everything on a future they couldn't guarantee. The harvest that fall produces approximately 300 bushels of apples. At $1 per bushel, the going rate for commercial quality fruit, that's $300. More money than the Wilders have seen in a single season since they left Dakota. More money than Laura's poultry operation generates in an entire year. Money that means they can pay debts, buy equipment, maybe even save something for the future. Almanzo stands in the orchard watching workers pick fruit and fill barrels, and for the first time in 7 years, he allows himself to believe that this might actually work, that Missouri might be the place where the Wilder family story stops being about failure and starts being about something else. Laura is less optimistic. She's seen too many promising seasons destroyed by weather, market crashes, or simple bad luck. But she's also practical enough to appreciate what they've built. 40 acres has become 60 through careful purchases of adjacent land. The small frame house is paid for. Rose is 14, doing well in school, showing signs of ambition that will eventually take her far beyond Mansfield. The farm is functioning. They're eating. They're surviving. And the apple trees, the gamble that seemed insane 7 years ago, are bearing fruit. Not just this year, but every year going forward. A permanent income source that will define the next decade of their lives and eventually fund the construction of the farmhouse that becomes their legacy. 7 years is a long time to wait, but sometimes, if you're stubborn enough and lucky enough and willing to work every single day toward a future you can barely imagine, 7 years becomes the bridge between failure and success. The apple trees are bearing. The wait is over. The real work can begin. Except that's not quite true, because the work never stopped. And in 1902, when Almanzo Wilder walks through his orchard in September and sees branches heavy with fruit, red and yellow globes that represent 7 years of faith and labour, he understands that real work is just a different category of the same endless cycle of effort that's defined every day since they arrived in Missouri. Harvest season 1902 transforms Rocky Ridge Farm from a subsistence operation into something resembling a business. The apple crop yields approximately 300 bushels, not spectacular by commercial orchard standards, but substantial by the standards of people who've been surviving on egg money and butter sales for 8 years. At roughly $1 per bushel, that's $300 in cash income, more money than Laura's poultry operation generates in an entire year. More money than they've seen from a single crop since the wheat harvest in Dakota that feel like they happened in a different lifetime to different people. Almanzo stands in the barn, counting barrels, calculating transportation costs to the Mansfield market, and allows himself something he hasn't permitted in over a decade: cautious optimism. Not joy, not celebration, just the quiet acknowledgement that maybe, possibly, the gamble is paying off. Laura is less impressed. She's learned that one good harvest doesn't erase debt or guarantee future success. She's seen too many promising seasons destroyed by late frost or hail, or market collapse to trust a single year's profits. But she's also practical enough to recognise opportunity when it presents itself. We can pay off the mercantile account, she says that evening. sitting at the kitchen table with paper and pencil, running calculations, and we can buy more land. Almanzo looks up from the Missouri Ruralist he's reading, a farm journal that's become his source for agricultural information, now that he can't rely on neighbours' experience or family knowledge. More land? The 20 acres adjacent to our western boundary. Freeman mentioned it's for sale. $40. $40. That's more than a month's income from eggs and butter. It's a new plough or 6 months of groceries. It's the kind of expense that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago when they were still waiting for the first apples to ripen. But it's also land. Clear land, or mostly clear. Freeman mentioned it had been partially logged, which means they wouldn't need to spend years removing timber. Land they could put into cultivation immediately. Land that could support more apple trees, a larger vegetable operation, maybe even a small vineyard if Almanzo's experiments with grape cuttings prove successful. We should do it, Almanzo says, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. We've been operating on 40 acres for 8 years. We need room to expand if we're going to make this work long term. Laura nods, makes a note on her paper, and moves to the next calculation. This is how prosperity begins, not with windfall or luck, but with careful deployment of modest resources towards strategic expansion. One good harvest becomes land purchase, becomes increased capacity, becomes the foundation for next year's larger operation. By November of 1902, they've purchased the adjacent 20 acres, bringing their total holdings to 60 acres. It's not yet the 200 acres the farm will eventually encompass, but it's growth. Visible, measurable progress that can be documented in property records and walked on actual soil rather than existing only as hope. The winter of 1902 to 1903 feels different from previous winters. Not easier. Missouri winters are still cold, still require constant wood chopping and animal care, and the kind of maintenance that never stops, but different. Less desperate. The pantry is better stocked. The debt is smaller. The apple trees survived another year, which means next year's harvest should be even larger as the trees reach full maturity. Rose, now 15 years old, has become indispensable to the farm operation. She's too old for the kind of child labour that filled her single-digit years, but she's also not yet fully adult, occupying that transitional space where she can contribute adult-level work while still attending school. She manages the chickens without supervision, collects eggs, monitors for signs of disease, and has developed her own theories about optimal feeding schedules that she argues with Laura using logic that's uncomfortably sophisticated. If we switch to a mash system instead of whole grain, Rose explains one evening in February, using the kind of confident tone that teenage girls employ when they've read something their mothers haven't, we should see about 15% increase in egg production. It's in the new extension bulletin from the university. Laura reads the bulletin. Rose is right, of course, because Rose is almost always right about things she's researched, and implements the change. Egg production increases. Rose tries very hard not to look smug and fails completely. This is the household dynamic of 1903. Almanzo manages the orchard and does what heavy work his body permits. Laura runs the dairy and poultry operations while maintaining the household, and Rose occupies an increasingly complex role as student, farm labourer, and intellectual force who's already demonstrating she's too smart for Mansfield, Missouri. The Wilders are no longer failing. They're not yet prosperous. Prosperity is still years away, still dependent on multiple factors aligning correctly. But they're stable. They're accumulating capital. They're making decisions about expansion rather than triage. In 1902, after 8 years of grinding labour on Rocky Ridge Farm, the land finally starts giving back more than it takes. It's not enough to erase the past. Nothing can erase the unnamed son buried in Dakota, or the house that burned, or the decade of catastrophes that preceded Missouri. But it's enough to imagine a future. And for people who've lived in perpetual crisis for over a decade, imagining a future is revolutionary. May 19th, 1903. Mansfield High School holds its graduation ceremony in the Methodist Church because the school building is too small for the occasion. Rose Wilder walks across the temporary stage wearing a white dress Laura spent 3 weeks sewing and receives her diploma as the sole graduate of her class. Not valedictorian, when you're the only graduate, that title becomes meaningless. Just graduate. the first person in her family to complete high school, the first person in Mansfield to attend college, which she'll do briefly in the fall. Laura sits in the audience and watches her daughter accept recognition for academic achievement, and feels the complicated mixture of pride and loss that parents experience when children reach milestones that simultaneously celebrate accomplishment and announce impending departure. Rose isn't leaving yet, not permanently, but everyone in that church understands that a girl who's smarter than her teachers, who reads Latin for pleasure and argues economics with adults, isn't going to spend her life on a Missouri hillside farm. Almanzo feels it too, though he doesn't articulate it beyond gripping Laura's hand slightly harder during the applause. Rose represents success of a different kind than farm prosperity. She's proof that the Missouri migration wasn't entirely about economic survival. It was also about giving their daughter opportunities she wouldn't have had in a rented house in failed Dakota. After the ceremony, during the reception where townspeople congratulate Rose with a slightly wary pride, small communities direct toward residents who've exceeded local boundaries. Freeman approaches Almanzo with a proposition that will reshape the farm again. "I've got 40 more acres adjacent to your property," Freeman says, keeping his voice low so the conversation stays private. "Timber, mostly, some cleared patches. I'm willing to sell for $75 if you're interested." $75. That's most of the profit from last year's apple harvest. It's a substantial investment in land that will require years of clearing before it produces income. But it's also opportunity, more room for orchard expansion, more timber for building materials or sale, more capacity for diversified agriculture. "Let me talk to my wife," Almanzo says, which is frontier code for, "I need to discuss this with the person who actually makes financial decisions in our household, even though social convention requires I pretend otherwise." Laura's response, delivered later that evening after Rose has gone to bed, is characteristically direct. "How much timber?" Freeman estimates maybe 5 acres of marketable oak and hickory. Laura does mental arithmetic. Timber prices, clearing costs, time to convert forest to cultivable land, opportunity cost of capital. If we harvest the timber carefully and sell it, that might cover 2/3 of the purchase price. The cleared sections could go into apple trees next spring. We'd need to take out a loan for the balance. "We haven't carried debt since '98, Almanzo points out. They paid off the original mortgage on their 40 acres 5 years ago. And since then they've operated debt-free. A point of pride for people who spent the Dakota years drowning in compound interest loans. "We also haven't expanded our income capacity significantly," Laura counters. "The orchard is reaching maximum production for the acreage we have planted. If we want to increase revenue, we need more trees, which means more land." They purchased the 40 acres in June of 1903, financing $25 at the Mansfield Bank. The loan comes with 6% interest and an 18-month repayment schedule that Laura immediately begins planning how to meet through increased egg sales and careful management of apple harvest proceeds. Rocky Ridge Farm now encompasses 100 acres, 60 they own clear, 40 they're paying off. It's a substantial operation by Wright County standards, though still modest compared to the industrial-scale farms emerging in more fertile regions. But it's theirs, and it's growing. Rose leaves for Crowley's Ridge College in Louisiana in September of 1903. The college is essentially a finishing school with minimal academic rigor, but it's the only higher education option accessible to a farm family in southern Missouri. She lasts one semester before returning home, bored and frustrated by curriculum that moves too slowly and focuses on subjects she mastered years ago. Her departure and return teach Laura something important about her daughter. Rose needs intellectual stimulation more than most people need food. Mansfield can't provide it. The farm can't provide it. Rural Missouri, for all its improved rainfall and apple-growing capacity, can't give Rose what she requires to thrive. So in spring of 1904, Rose takes telegraphy training in Sedalia, Missouri, a practical skill that will let her earn wages while pursuing the broader world she's clearly destined for. By fall of 1904, she's secured a telegraphy position in Kansas City and moves away permanently, visiting home but never truly returning in the way parents hope their children will return. The farm loses a labourer. Laura loses daily proximity to her only surviving child. But Rose gains independence and the chance at a life that isn't defined by soil and weather, and the endless calculation of whether there's enough. It's the right choice. Laura knows it's the right choice. That doesn't make it hurt less. 1904. The apple orchard is fully mature, producing consistently, generating annual income between $300 and $500, depending on weather and market prices. The dairy operation, now expanded to 2 Jersey cows, produces butter and cream that Laura sells to regular customers in Mansfield. The vegetable garden feeds the household and generates small surplus for sale. But the real economic engine of Rocky Ridge Farm, the operation that generates the most reliable income with the best profit margins, is Laura's poultry business. By 1905, Laura is managing approximately 200 chickens. Not 200 as a theoretical flock size or seasonal peak, 200 as a maintained population, carefully managed for optimal production, with rigorous culling of non-productive birds and systematic breeding for desirable traits. It's commercial-scale poultry farming. And Laura runs it with the precision of someone who understands that this operation is the difference between stability and crisis. The chickens are Leghorns, an Italian breed characterized by white feathers, nervous temperament, and exceptional egg production. Leghorns aren't good for meat. They're too small, too lean, producing carcasses that look more like feathered skeletons than the plump birds consumers prefer. But they lay eggs with almost mechanical consistency, producing 250 to 300 eggs per bird annually under optimal management. Laura has become expert at creating optimal conditions. The hen houses she designed and Almanzo built are oriented to maximize sunlight exposure while preventing drafts. The roosts are positioned to minimize fighting and pecking order violence. The nesting boxes are dark and private, encouraging hens to lay in predictable locations rather than hiding eggs in random corners. The feeding system delivers precise rations calculated to maximize production without waste. She keeps meticulous records, which hens lay most consistently, which bloodlines produce healthiest chicks, which feeding schedules correlate with peak production. It's scientific poultry management decades before the term exists, driven not by academic training but by economic necessity, and Laura's particular genius for systematic observation. The numbers tell the story. 200 hens producing an average of 5 eggs per day per hen translates to roughly 1,000 eggs daily. Actually, that math is wrong. 200 hens don't each lay daily, and Laura doesn't have 200 hens in production simultaneously because some are always brooding or molting. More realistic calculation, 200 hens with 70% in active production equals 140 laying hens. At 5 eggs per week per hen, Leghorns don't lay daily year-round. That's 700 eggs weekly, or 100 eggs daily. At 15 cents per dozen, the rate Laura charges her regular customers, that's $1.25 daily, or roughly $8.75 weekly. Across a year, accounting for seasonal variation and reduced winter production, Laura's chicken operation generates approximately $300 to $400 annually. That's comparable to the apple orchard income, except the chickens produce year-round, require less land, and aren't vulnerable to late frosts or hail that can destroy an entire fruit crop in minutes. The poultry operation is diversification in its most practical form, multiple income streams reducing dependence on any single source. But managing 200 chickens isn't passive income, it's daily labour. Laura rises before dawn every morning to let the hens out, check water supplies, distribute feed calculated to precise nutritional ratios. She monitors for signs of disease, respiratory infections, parasites, the mysterious ailments that can devastate a flock overnight. She culls non-productive birds ruthlessly, because sentimentality is a luxury farm economics don't permit. She cleans hen houses weekly, removing accumulated manure that she composts for garden fertilizer, because waste is money lost. The egg collection and processing happens twice daily. Eggs must be gathered quickly to prevent hens from breaking and eating them, a habit that, once started, spreads through a flock-like contagion. Each egg is inspected for cracks, cleaned if soiled, and sorted by size. Laura delivers to customers 3 times weekly, maintaining relationships that depend on reliability and consistent quality. This is Laura's domain. Almanzo doesn't interfere, doesn't offer advice, barely enters the henhouses except for major repairs. He understands that this operation is Laura's expertise, her income, her contribution to household finances that's as essential as his orchard management. The gender dynamics of frontier agriculture are complex. Men supposedly run farms, women supposedly keep house. But Rocky Ridge Farm operates on different logic. Whoever can do the work most efficiently does it, and Laura is the superior poultry manager. By 1906, Laura's reputation extends beyond Mansfield. Other farm wives ask her advice about chicken management. The agricultural extension agent from the county seat visits Rocky Ridge to observe her operation and take notes for the extension bulletin. She's becoming recognised as an authority, not officially, not with credentials or title, but through demonstrated expertise that produces results. This recognition will matter later. In 1911, when Laura begins writing for the Missouri Ruralist, her poultry articles will carry authority earned through 15 years of commercial-scale management. Editors will publish her pieces because she's not theorising about chickens. She's reporting methods she's proven profitable through actual implementation. But that's still 5 years away. In 1906, Laura is 40 years old, managing 200 chickens, helping Almanzo with orchard work, maintaining the household, and beginning to recognise that she's built something substantial. Not just a business, an identity separate from farmer's wife or pioneer woman or any other category society tries to impose on rural women. The chickens are hers. The income they generate is hers. The expertise she's developed belongs to her in ways that land ownership, legally Almanzo's, never can. And in an era when married women's economic contributions are routinely dismissed as helping rather than working, Laura's $400 annual poultry income makes her a significant economic actor in ways frontier mythology rarely acknowledges. She doesn't articulate this, doesn't write about women's economic agency or gender equity or the politics of farm labour division. She just manages her chickens, deposits her egg money, and knows that if Almanzo's orchard failed tomorrow, if hail destroyed every apple, if blight killed every tree, she could keep the family solvent through poultry sales alone. That's not theoretical empowerment, that's practical survival capacity. And on a farm built from $100 and desperation, survival capacity is the most valuable asset anyone can possess. That's not theoretical empowerment, that's practical survival capacity. And on a farm built from $100 and desperation, survival capacity is the most valuable asset anyone can possess. But Laura Ingalls Wilder, at 40 years old in 1907, has started thinking beyond survival. For the first time since leaving Dakota 13 years ago, she's thinking about permanence, about legacy, about building something that will outlast the daily calculations of whether there's enough. The small frame house they've occupied since 1898 is functional. It has walls and a roof, and rooms where they sleep and eat and conduct the business of staying alive. But it's not what Laura wants. It's not what they deserve after 13 years of transforming 40 acres of rocks and timber into a working farm generating real income. She begins planning the new house in winter of 1907, sitting at the kitchen table with paper and pencil, drawing floor plans with the precision of an architect who happens to be a farm wife with no formal training, but very clear ideas about what a house should be. Almanzo watches her work and doesn't interrupt. They've been married 22 years, long enough that he knows when to offer structural advice and when to stay quiet while she figures things out. This is Laura's project, her vision, her house in ways that go beyond whose name will appear on the deed. 10 rooms, she says, not asking, stating. Almanzo nods. 10 rooms is ambitious for a Missouri farm family. Most neighbours live in 4 or 5 room houses. 10 rooms signals prosperity, stability, the kind of comfort that people who started with nothing rarely achieve. We can do 10 rooms. Laura's design includes features that practical farm wives aren't supposed to want. Large windows, expensive, difficult to heat in winter, but flooding rooms with natural light that makes the space feel twice its actual size. Built-in bookcases in what will be the parlour, because Laura owns books and intends to acquire more, and books deserve proper housing just like people do. A study with a desk positioned to catch morning light, where she can manage farm accounts and write her Missouri ruralist articles without competing for table space with meal preparation. It's a writer's house, though Laura doesn't think of herself as a writer yet. She thinks of herself as someone who occasionally writes agricultural articles for magazine publication. The distinction seems important to her. Writers are people like Rose, who's now living in Kansas City working as a telegraph operator and writing newspaper pieces. Laura just reports what she knows about chickens. But the house she's designing reveals something Laura hasn't articulated to herself. She's building a space for intellectual work, not just domestic labour. The study isn't a sewing room or extra storage. It's a place for thinking, for writing, for the kind of work that happens inside your head rather than near hen houses or gardens. Foundation in stone, Almanzo says, studying her drawings. We've got enough rocks on this property. They both smile at that, the rocks that gave Rocky Ridge Farm its name, that Laura has been cursing and moving and stacking for 13 years, will finally become something beautiful. The foundation stones will be cut from the limestone they've been clearing, shaped and fitted by hands that know every inch of this land's particular geology. Construction begins in spring of 1908. Almanzo oversees the foundation work, hiring local labour for the heavy lifting his disability won't permit. Laura watches stonemasons position limestone blocks weighing hundreds of pounds each, creating a foundation that's built to support not just a house, but generations. This isn't temporary, this is forever. The foundation work takes most of 1908 and into 1909. It's slow, expensive, labour-intensive construction that can't be rushed because stone doesn't forgive mistakes. Each block must be positioned precisely, levelled carefully, fitted to its neighbours with the kind of attention that separates architecture from mere building. Laura continues managing the poultry operation through construction, because chickens don't stop laying eggs just because you're building a house. The 200 hens still require daily feeding, watering, egg collection, and the constant management that keeps production high and disease low. The apple orchard still needs attention. Pruning, fertilising, pest management that Almanzo coordinates but increasingly delegates to hired help as his age and disability makes sustained physical work more difficult. Rose visits from Kansas City that summer, newly married to Gillette Lane, a marriage that will last less than a decade but currently represents her claim to adult independence. She walks the construction site with her mother, looking at foundation stones and floor plans, and asks the question that's probably been forming since Laura first mentioned the building project. Why now? Laura doesn't have a simple answer. Because they can afford it? Because 13 years of living in cramped quarters has earned them the right to space? Because she's 41 years old and wants to build something permanent before age makes that impossible? Because it's time, Laura says finally. We've waited long enough. Rose nods, understanding something unspoken. Her parents spent the first decade in Missouri just surviving. The second decade building capacity. More land, more income, more stability. Now entering their third decade on Rocky Ridge Farm, they're finally building the life they imagined back in 1894, when they arrived with $100 and couldn't afford imagination. The stone foundation is completed by fall of 1909. Laura stands in the centre of what will be her house, surrounded by stone walls rising 3 feet above ground level, and allows herself to feel something she hasn't permitted since Dakota. Certainty. This house will be finished. This farm will support them. Missouri was the right choice. Almanzo joins her, leaning on his cane, looking at the foundation with the expression of a man who's built something significant. Good stonework, he says, which is his version of profound satisfaction. It'll last, Laura agrees, and means more than just the stones. Frame construction begins in spring of 1910. Oak timber cut from their own property, trees they cleared years ago left to season, now milled into dimensional lumber that smells like Missouri forests and represents value they created with their own labour. Almanzo does much of the fine carpentry himself, working within his physical limitations to create the built-in features that will make this house extraordinary rather than merely functional. The dining room will have built-in buffet with oak panelling. The parlour will have floor-to-ceiling bookcases. The study will have a desk Almanzo is building custom, designed to Laura's specifications with drawers sized for her account books and writing materials. Every detail reflects their particular needs, their particular story. This isn't a house built from catalogue plans. It's architecture that emerged from 13 years of understanding exactly what they need. Construction continues through 1910 and into 1911. Progress is slower than Laura wants because they're paying as they go, refusing to take on significant construction debt. When money for materials runs out, construction stops until the next apple harvest, or egg sales accumulate enough to buy glass or hardware or roofing. It's fiscally conservative to the point of painful, but they've learned that debt is dangerous and patience is survivable. While walls rise slowly on the hillside, something else is happening that will prove equally significant to Laura's future. She's becoming a public writer. It starts in late 1910 when John Case, editor of the local Mansfield newspaper, suggests Laura submit an article to the Missouri Ruralist, a statewide agricultural journal with circulation reaching thousands of Missouri farm families. Case has been reading Laura's occasional pieces for local publications and recognizes that she has something valuable, practical agricultural knowledge presented in accessible, engaging prose. Laura hesitates. She's written for local audiences, for people who already know her and understand her context. Writing for strangers, for an audience that will judge her words without knowing her history or her chickens or the particular challenges of Ozark farming, that's different. That's exposing herself to criticism in ways that selling eggs never required. But she writes the piece anyway. Favours the small farm home, an essay arguing that small diversified farms represent better quality of life than large industrial operations chasing maximum profit. It's not particularly radical agricultural economics, but it's written with conviction that comes from living the argument rather than theorising it. The Missouri Ruralist publishes Favours the Small Farm Home on February 18, 1911. Laura's byline appears at the top, by Mrs. A.J. Wilder, Rocky Ridge Farm, Mansfield, Missouri. Not Laura Ingalls Wilder. That identity doesn't exist publicly yet. She's Mrs. A.J. Wilder, farm wife and poultry specialist, whose authority derives partly from her husband's name. The piece resonates. Readers write letters praising her perspective, asking questions about specific farming practices, requesting more articles on topics ranging from poultry management to household economics. The editor requests additional submissions. By summer of 1911, Laura has become a regular contributor, not quite a columnist, but a recognised voice in Missouri agricultural discourse. Her articles cover practical topics: chicken diseases and prevention strategies, dairy management for quality butter production, seasonal garden planning, efficient household organisation. But they also contain philosophy, ideas about rural life's value, about self-sufficiency as moral good, about the satisfaction of work that produces tangible results. She's not just teaching people how to raise chickens, she's articulating a world view. This matters more than Laura realises in 1911. She's developing skills, clarity of expression, narrative structure, the ability to explain complex processes in accessible language that will prove essential 20 years later when she begins writing the Little House books. The Missouri Ruralist articles are Laura's apprenticeship, though she doesn't know she's training for anything beyond farm journalism. Almanzo reads her published pieces and offers sparse praise. That's good, or makes sense, which Laura understands as significant approval from a man who doesn't waste words. Rose, visiting from Kansas City where her own journalism career is advancing, reads her mother's work with more critical eye. "You should be getting paid more for these," Rose says, reviewing a check for $3 that arrived for Laura's latest article on poultry breeding. "This is professional quality writing." "It's $3 for a few hours of work," Laura counters. "That's better than most wages available to women." That's not the point. Rose's voice carries the impatience of someone who's fought for recognition in competitive urban journalism and sees her mother underselling herself. "You're worth more than this." Laura doesn't argue, but she also doesn't demand higher payment. She's 44 years old, learning to navigate a professional world that barely recognises farm women as having expertise worth compensating. $3 per article feels like success, not exploitation. She'll accept more if offered, but she won't risk losing the platform by seeming difficult or greedy. The farmhouse construction reaches major completion in late 1911. The exterior is finished. Walls, roof, windows, doors. Interior work continues through winter. Flooring, painting, the detailed finish carpentry that transforms bare rooms into spaces that feel intentional and beautiful. By spring of 1912, the house is habitable. Laura and Almanzo move into the 10-room farmhouse in April of 1912, 18 years after arriving in Missouri with $100 and a wagon. The house cost approximately $3,000 to $5,000 in materials and hired labour. The exact figure isn't documented, but estimates based on comparable construction suggest this range. Much of the value came from family labour uncounted in financial records. Almanzo's carpentry, Laura's design work, the oak timber they harvested themselves. They walk through empty rooms before moving furniture, their footsteps echoing on new floors. Laura stands in the study, her study, with the custom desk and morning light streaming through windows she specified, and feels something close to triumph. Not joy, exactly. She's too pragmatic for uncomplicated happiness. But satisfaction. The deep, earned satisfaction of completing something you started when completion seemed impossible. "We did it," Almanzo says, standing beside her. Not a question. Acknowledgement. "We did," Laura agrees, and means more than the house. Means the farm, the 18 years, the survival that became stability that became this. Proof that starting over was possible, even after everything fell apart. By 1912, Rocky Ridge Farm encompasses 200 acres. Not the original 40 they purchased in 1894, but 5 times that, accumulated gradually through strategic purchases of adjacent land. Each acquisition representing surplus capital deployed toward expansion rather than consumption. The arithmetic of growth tells the story. 1894, 40 acres purchased for $400. Circa 1896 to 1898, 20 additional acres. Circa 1900 to 1903, 40 more acres. Circa 1904 to 1910, another 100 acres acquired through multiple transactions. The exact dates for middle acquisitions are uncertain. Property records confirm ownership but don't always document precise transaction dates. What matters is the pattern. Consistent expansion funded by farm income. Each purchase increasing capacity for larger operations that generate revenue to fund next purchase. It's compound growth powered by reinvestment rather than debt. The farm in 1912 operates as a diversified commercial agricultural enterprise. Orchards, approximately 400 apple trees in full production, plus smaller plantings of pears, plums and cherries. The apples remain the primary fruit crop. Ben Davis varieties chosen for storage durability and commercial marketability, rather than eating quality. Annual harvest yields vary with weather, but average 300 to 500 bushels, generating $300 to $600 depending on market prices. Livestock, 20 hogs raised for meat and sale, multiple Jersey dairy cows providing milk, cream and butter. Workhorses, Morgan's, Almanzo's lifelong passion, used for farm labour and occasionally bred for sale. The livestock operation is substantial enough that it requires daily management and generates steady income through dairy sales and periodic livestock sales. Poultry. Laura's domain has expanded to approximately 200 chickens maintained year-round. The Leghorn flock produces eggs sold to regular customers in Mansfield and to regional distributors. Annual income from poultry operations runs $300 to $400, comparable to the orchard, but more reliable because it's not subject to single-season weather catastrophe. Buildings. The new 10-room farmhouse serves as residential space and farm office. Multiple barns house livestock and equipment. Chicken houses, designed by Laura, built by Almanzo, protect the valuable poultry flock. Storage buildings hold tools, feed and harvested produce. The infrastructure represents significant capital investment and reflects 18 years of gradual construction. Equipment. Wagons for transporting produce to market. Full complement of hand tools and farm implements. Nothing mechanized. Tractors won't become affordable for farms this size for another decade. But they own what they need, maintained in good repair, replaced when necessary rather than patched indefinitely. The estimated value of Rocky Ridge Farm in 1912 is approximately $10,000. This figure represents conservative estimate based on property tax assessments and regional comparable sales. Some scholars suggest the value might have been $12,000 to $15,000 at peak. Either way, it represents a return on investment of 10,000% or more on the original $100 cash stake. But that calculation is misleading in important ways. The $100 wasn't the total investment. It was the liquid capital. The real investment was 18 years of labour, every day from multiple people. Laura's daily chicken management, Almanzo's orchard work, Rose's childhood labour before she left. Hired workers whose wages came from farm income but whose labour was essential to expansion. You can't calculate return on investment when most of the investment was time and physical effort that never appeared in ledgers. The $10,000 valuation represents wealth, yes, but it also represents 18 years of aging, 18 years of Almanzo's body declining from disability and time, 18 years of Laura's hands working until they ached. That's not calculable in financial terms. Still, $10,000, 200 acres, a 10-room farmhouse that's beautiful and functional and permanent, commercial operations in apples, dairy, poultry, generating annual income sufficient to support comfortable middle-class rural life. This is success by any reasonable measure. Laura, at 45 years old, manages the household, the poultry operation, the dairy work, contributes to orchard labour during harvest, maintains extensive garden that feeds them and generates surplus for sale, and writes regular articles for Missouri ruralists that are bringing in modest but meaningful income. She's busier now than she was during survival years, though the labour is less desperate. She's building rather than merely persisting. Almanzo at 55 is aging in ways that his disability accelerates. The partial paralysis in his left leg hasn't worsened, but it also hasn't improved, and decades of compensating with his right leg and using a cane have created secondary problems: joint pain, reduced mobility, fatigue that hits earlier each year. He still manages the farm, but increasingly through supervision rather than personal labour. He hires help for heavy work, delegates tasks that require sustained physical effort, and focuses on skilled work: grafting trees, training horses, the precision carpentry that built interior features of the farmhouse. They're comfortable, not wealthy. That's an important distinction that popular accounts sometimes miss. They work constantly. They still calculate expenses carefully. They can't afford luxuries that urban middle-class families take for granted, but they're not poor, they're not desperate. They eat well, dress adequately, maintain their property, and have resources to handle ordinary emergencies without catastrophe. Rocky Ridge Farm in 1912 represents something rare in American agricultural history. A genuinely successful small farm built from almost nothing by a partially disabled man and his wife on marginal land during a period when large-scale industrial agriculture was beginning to dominate. Most similar operations failed. Most Ozark settlers either gave up and left or struggled indefinitely without achieving real prosperity. The Wilders are exceptional, and their exceptionality makes their story both inspiring and somewhat misleading as a model. Rosa's left permanently by 1912. She's 25, married and divorced from Gillette Lane within 3 years, building journalism career in San Francisco, sending occasional money home to parents, but maintaining distance from rural Missouri that she found intellectually stifling. Her relationship with Laura is complicated. Love mixed with resentment, pride mixed with criticism, the particular tension that exists between ambitious daughters and mothers who sacrificed for them. The farm will continue operating for decades. Laura and Almanzo will age into their 60s and 70s, gradually reducing operations, eventually renting out portions of land they can't manage themselves, but 1912 represents the peak, maximum acreage, maximum production, maximum achievement. Everything after will be maintenance and slow decline. On summer evenings in 1912, Laura sometimes sits on the porch of the farmhouse she designed, looking out over land that's been transformed from forest to farm over 18 years, and allows herself to feel what she hasn't permitted often: satisfaction. Not happiness, that's too simple. But the complex satisfaction of having built something real, something lasting, something that proves the Missouri migration wasn't another failure. 40 acres has become 200. $100 has become 10,000. A log cabin has become a 10-room farmhouse with oak floors and built-in bookcases. A desperate last attempt has become a successful farm that will sustain them through old age and eventually become a museum where 50,000 visitors annually will walk the grounds and wonder how two ordinary people achieve something extraordinary. The answer is simpler than it seems. Work. Daily. Grinding. Relentless work. Strategic decisions. Diversification. Adaptation to disability. Partnership between Laura and Almanzo that distributed labour according to capability rather than gender ideology. Community support. Some luck. Weather that cooperated more often than it catastrophically failed. Markets that valued their products. Health that held mostly intact. And faith. Not religious faith necessarily, though they had that too, but faith that if you worked hard enough, long enough, smart enough, eventually the land would give back more than it took. Faith that 7 years waiting for apple trees to bear would end with harvest rather than disaster. Faith that Missouri could be different from Dakota, that this time would be different from last time, that starting over was possible even after you'd failed before. In 1912, that faith has been validated. Rocky Ridge Farm is real. The dream has been built. And Laura Ingalls Wilder, farm wife, poultry expert, emerging writer, has proven that even after catastrophic loss, rebuilding is possible. The best work of her life, the writing that will make her famous and define how generations understand American frontier experience, is still 20 years away. She doesn't know that yet. Right now, she's 45 years old, managing chickens and writing farm articles and living in a house she designed. It's enough. More than enough. It's everything she spent 18 years building. But Laura Ingalls Wilder, at 45 years old in 1912, is discovering that building doesn't stop when the house is finished. Because the farm she and Almanzo constructed from $100, and desperation has given her something unexpected. Authority. And authority, it turns out, has its own demands. The Missouri Ruralist articles continue beyond that first February 1911 publication. One piece becomes 2. 2 becomes 5. By 1913, Laura is a regular contributor, not quite a columnist with guaranteed space, but a recognised voice that editors actively solicit. They want her perspective on poultry management, on household economics, on the particular challenges of making small-scale farming profitable in an era when industrial agriculture is beginning to dominate. She writes at the desk Almanzo built in the study with windows facing east, catching morning light that makes the paper look almost luminous. The chickens can wait an extra hour. The eggs will still be there. This work, the intellectual work of translating 20 years of farming experience into words that strangers can understand and use, feels as essential as any physical labour she's performed. My work becomes a recurring theme in her articles. Not women's work or helping with farm work, but actual work, labour that produces value, that requires skill, that deserves recognition and compensation. She writes about this carefully, because challenging gender assumptions too directly will get her dismissed as radical. But she plants the ideas in practical advice about poultry breeding and butter production, letting readers draw their own conclusions about who's actually running farm operations. The checks arrive irregularly. $3 here, $5 there. It's modest income compared to what the apple orchard or poultry operation generates. But it's her income, earned through her name, paid for her expertise. Mrs. A.J. Wilder, the byline reads, still defined by her husband's initials because that's how professional women navigate 19-teens Missouri. But underneath those initials is Laura's voice, Laura's knowledge, Laura's particular way of explaining complex agricultural processes in language that's clear and occasionally beautiful. Almanzo reads her published pieces and offers his sparse approval. "That's useful," he says about an article on preventing poultry diseases. "People should know that." It's not effusive praise, but Laura understands what he's saying. You're contributing. This matters. Keep doing it. Rose, visiting from San Francisco, where her journalism career is advancing in ways that dwarf Laura's regional farm writing, reads her mother's work with more critical eye. She suggests editorial changes, questions word choices, pushes Laura towards sharper arguments. It's helpful and irritating in equal measure. The particular tension of a daughter who's surpassed her mother professionally but still recognises where her own skills originated. "You should be writing more than agricultural advice," Rose says during a visit in 1914. "You have stories, the Dakota years, the journey here. Building this farm, that's narrative, not instruction." Laura dismisses this. Nobody wants to read about that. It's just ordinary farm life. "Nothing about your life has been ordinary," Rose counters. But she doesn't push. Not yet. That conversation will happen again, years later, when the agricultural journalism market has shifted and Laura is looking for new outlets for the voice she's finally found. The Missouri ruralist work continues through World War I, when agricultural writing takes on patriotic urgency. Produce more food, support the war effort, make every farm acre count toward victory. Laura writes about efficient poultry management as contribution to national defence. It's not untrue exactly. But it's also strange to see her practical advice about chicken feed transformed into wartime propaganda. The armistice in 1918 doesn't end her writing, but it changes the agricultural landscape. Prices that spiked during war years collapse afterward. Farmers who expanded operations during the boom face catastrophic debt in the bust. Laura writes about this too, about managing farms through economic volatility, about the dangers of overexpansion, about the value of diversification that keeps families afloat when single crops fail. She's writing from experience. Rocky Ridge Farm survived Dakota drought and Missouri's early poverty precisely because they didn't bet everything on one income source. The orchard provides good years and mediocre years. The poultry operation produces reliable income regardless. The dairy work generates steady small revenue. When apple prices drop, egg sales compensate. It's agricultural wisdom earned through decades of actual practice, not theory developed in university extension offices. By 1920, Laura has published approximately 70 articles in Missouri Ruralist. By 1924, when her regular contributions taper off, the total approaches 100 pieces. It's a substantial body of work, more than many professional journalists produce in equivalent timeframes, and it establishes Laura as something she never planned to become. A writer, not a novelist yet. Not the author of books that will shape how millions of people understand American frontier experience. Just a farm journalist who discovered she could translate physical labour into words, could make 20 years of chicken raising and butter churning and orchard tending into knowledge that other people valued enough to pay for. The farm writing career teaches Laura skills she doesn't yet know she'll need. Clarity of expression, narrative structure, the ability to take complex technical processes and explain them in language that's accessible without being condescending, how to write about hardship without self-pity, how to present expertise without arrogance. These are the tools she'll use in 1932 when she begins writing Little House in the Big Woods, but that's still 8 years away. Right now, in 1924, she's just a 57-year-old farm woman who writes articles about chickens and occasionally wonders if there's more she should be saying. The 1920s bring changes to Rocky Ridge Farm that have nothing to do with expansion or improvement, and everything to do with aging and adaptation. Almanzo is 67 years old in 1924. The partial paralysis in his left leg that's defined his physical capabilities for 35 years hasn't worsened, but age compounds disability in ways that make sustained labour increasingly difficult. He can still manage orchard work, pruning, grafting, the skilled tasks that require knowledge more than strength, but the heavy lifting, the prolonged standing, the physical demands of maintaining 200 acres, that's beyond him now. They hire more help. Young men from Mansfield who need wages and don't mind farm work. The Wilders pay fair rates and treat hired labour with respect that's not universal among Missouri farmers. But hiring labour changes the farm's economics. Wages reduce profit margins, make operations that were barely profitable become questionable investments. Some of the outlying acreage goes unused or gets rented to neighbours who farm it on shares. Laura, at 57 in 1924, is also ageing in ways that affect farm operations. The poultry flock that once numbered 200 chickens gradually reduces to more manageable size. Maybe 100 birds, then 75, then fewer as her energy and time permit. She's still capable of the work, still knows chicken management better than almost anyone in Wright County. But the daily grind of feeding, watering, collecting eggs, cleaning hen houses, managing health, it's less appealing when you're approaching 60 than it was at 40. The apple orchard continues producing, though yields vary year to year based on weather and the inevitable decline that affects aging trees. Some of the original trees planted in the 1890s are now 30 years old, past peak production, though still generating fruit. Almanzo talks about replanting sections, establishing new trees that will bear fruit for decades after he's gone. But replanting is future-oriented work, and increasingly the Wilders are living in present tense. The farm that was built through relentless forward momentum, always expanding, always improving, always calculating how to increase capacity, shifts into maintenance mode. Not decline exactly, but a recognition that growth has limits, that age imposes constraints, that the $10,000 farm they built doesn't need to become a $20,000 farm to validate their efforts. Rose visits occasionally, though her life is increasingly distant from Rocky Ridge's rhythms. She's living in California and New York, writing for national publications, building literary and journalistic career that's far more prominent than Laura's regional farm writing. She sends money periodically, not charity, but filial support that aging parents don't refuse even though they don't technically need it. The farm supports them, but Rose's contributions allow small luxuries, reduce the pressure to monetize every possible farm activity. The mother-daughter relationship remains complicated. Rose loves the farm in abstract, as symbol, as origin story, as the place where her parents achieved something remarkable. But she also resents it for representing limitations, for being the world she fought to escape, for embodying values she's philosophically rejected as she's moved toward a libertarian political ideology that will define her later career. Laura understands this, though they don't discuss it explicitly. Daughters leave. That's natural. Rose built a life that farm education made possible, even if that life looks nothing like the one Laura lived. There's pride in that, mixed with the particular loneliness of parents whose children succeed beyond them. The 1920s also bring technological changes that slowly penetrate rural Missouri. Automobiles become more common. The Wilders purchase one eventually, though Almanzo, who spent his youth training Morgan horses, regards cars with suspicion. Electric lines are extending into rural areas, though Rocky Ridge remains without electricity through most of the decade. Radio brings distant voices into farm kitchens, connecting rural families to urban culture in ways that feel both exciting and vaguely threatening. Laura watches these changes with the mixed feelings of someone who's lived through multiple technological revolutions. She remembers when railroads were the new technology transforming frontier life. Now automobiles and radios are doing the same thing, making distance shorter, making isolation less absolute. It's progress, but it's also loss. The particular self-sufficiency that defined frontier farming becomes less necessary when you can drive to town for supplies or hear news from New York the same day it happens. The Missouri Ruralist articles become less frequent through the 1920s and stop completely by mid-decade. Partly this reflects changing agricultural journalism market. The magazine's focus shifts, new voices emerge, Laura's expertise becomes less immediately relevant as farming itself modernizes. But it also reflects Laura's own transition away from active farm management towards something else she hasn't quite identified yet. She's writing more in her personal journals now, not farm records or account books, but something closer to memoir, fragmentary recollections of Dakota years, of the journey to Missouri, of early Rocky Ridge experiences when survival was uncertain. She's not writing for publication. At least that's what she tells herself. She's just recording what she remembers before memory fades further, before the people who lived these experiences, Charles and Carolyn Ingalls, Almanzo's parents, neighbors from Dakota and early Missouri years, die and take their versions of events with them. Rose encourages this writing during her visits, suggests that maybe there's a book in Laura's memories, suggests that people might want to read about frontier experience from someone who actually lived it, rather than romanticized it from safe urban distance. Laura remains skeptical, but she keeps writing anyway, filling tablets with recollections that will eventually become the foundation for Pioneer Girl, the memoir manuscript that Rose will push her to write in 1930, which will be rejected by publishers, but will provide the raw material for the Little House books. The farm in the 1920s is still beautiful. The apple trees bloom each spring with white flowers that transform the hillside into something that looks deliberate rather than accidental. The stone farmhouse sits solid and permanent on high ground, proof that 40 acres of rocks and timber could become home. The limestone walls that Laura and Almanzo built from cleared fieldstone still stand, marking boundaries and demonstrating that obstacles can become infrastructure. But it's a different beauty than the achievement they felt in 1912. That was victory, the visible proof that they'd succeeded where they'd previously failed. This is legacy, the understanding that what they built will outlast them, that the farm exists independent of their daily labour, that permanence has been achieved. Almanzo walks the orchard less frequently but with more attention. He knows these trees individually, remembers planting each one, can identify varieties by leaf shape and bark texture. They're partners in a project that took 30 years, from planting in 1895 to mature production in the 1920s. Most people don't get 30 years with anything. Most projects fail or transform or get abandoned long before 3 decades pass. Laura stands on the porch of the farmhouse she designed and watches evening light move across land that's been transformed from wilderness into agriculture. She's 60 years old. Almanzo is 70. They've lived on this property for 34 years, longer than most marriages last, longer than most businesses survive, longer than seemed possible when they arrived with $100 and uncertainty. The work isn't finished. Work on a farm is never finished. But it's different work now, maintenance rather than building, sustaining rather than expanding, remembering rather than planning. And in the space that opens up when relentless forward motion finally slows, Laura discovers she has something else to do, something that will prove more lasting than the farm itself, though she doesn't know that yet. She has stories to write, and for the first time in 60 years, she has time to write them. 1930. Laura Ingalls. Wilder is 63 years old, living on a farm that's been her home for 36 years, and she's about to become someone completely different. The Great Depression has collapsed American agriculture. Farm prices that declined through the 1920s have cratered completely. Families who survived war boom and peacetime bust are now facing catastrophe that makes previous difficulties look manageable. Foreclosures multiply, banks fail. The rural poverty that the Wilders knew in 1894 returns with vengeance, except now it's happening to people who thought they'd achieved security. Rocky Ridge survives because the Wilders own it outright. No mortgage, no crushing debt, just property taxes they can cover through reduced operations. They eat from the garden and the orchard. They sell enough eggs and butter to cover expenses. They're not prosperous, but they're surviving, which makes them fortunate beyond measure. Rose, now 43 and an established journalist and novelist, pushes her mother toward a project she's been suggesting for years. Write the memoir. Write about Dakota, about the prairie childhood, about frontier experience that's vanishing as elderly pioneers die without recording their stories. Publishers are interested in authentic frontier narratives, Rose insists. There's market demand. Laura is skeptical. She's written farm journalism, not literature. Her Missouri ruralist articles taught her clarity and structure, but autobiography is different. It requires revealing things she's spent decades keeping private. The poverty, the failures, the unnamed son buried in Dakota, the near catastrophes that don't fit inspirational pioneer narratives. But she writes it anyway, sits at her desk through 1930, and produces a manuscript she titles Pioneer Girl, 200 pages covering her life from birth through marriage, including material that will never appear in the published Little House books. It's honest in ways that will prove commercially problematic. It discusses poverty without romanticizing it. It includes uncomfortable racial content reflecting period attitudes. It presents frontier life as difficult and often disappointing. Rose edits the manuscript heavily and submits it to New York publishers. It's rejected, multiple times. Publishers find it too dark, too adult, not marketable. But in the rejection, there's suggestion. Maybe children's literature, maybe soften it, structure it differently, focus on childhood rather than full life story. Laura resists initially. She's not a children's author. She's a farm journalist who tried to write memoir and failed. But Rose persists, and eventually Laura begins rewriting Pioneer Girl as Little House in the Big Woods, a children's book focused on her Wisconsin childhood, stripping away adult perspective and presenting frontier life through child's eyes. The collaboration between Laura and Rose on the Little House books remains one of literature's most debated relationships. Rose clearly edited heavily, possibly rewrote sections, contributed structural and stylistic elements that shaped final published versions. But the stories, the memories, the essential content, those come from Laura. It's partnership, though scholars and fans continue arguing about exact division of labour. Little House in the Big Woods publishes in 1932. Laura is 65. It's modestly successful. Good reviews, decent sales, enough that publisher requests a sequel. Farmer Boy follows in 1933, covering Almanzo's New York childhood. Then Little House on the Prairie in 1935, returning to Laura's story. The books transform Laura from obscure farm journalist to recognised author. Fan mail arrives, children wanting to know more about frontier life, adults remembering their own frontier childhoods, teachers using the books in classrooms. Laura answers letters carefully, maintaining the persona of Laura, the character, while being privately aware of distance between literary representation and historical reality. The irony isn't lost on her. The farm that consumed 40 years of physical labour has made her famous for writing about everything that happened before the farm existed. Rocky Ridge, the achievement she and Almanzo built from $100 in desperation, barely appears in the published books. The Missouri years remain largely undocumented, too recent and too personal to transform into children's literature. But Rocky Ridge is the foundation for everything. The farmhouse provides the physical space where she writes. The financial security the farm generates allows her to write without immediate commercial pressure. The decades of farm journalism develop skills she uses to craft clear, accessible prose. The partnership with Almanzo modelled the collaboration she now has with Rose. Most fundamentally, the farm proved that recovery is possible, that you can fail catastrophically, lose everything, bury children, watch dreams collapse, and still rebuild. That 40 acres of rocks can become 200 acres of productive land. That $100 can become $10,000 if you work hard enough, long enough, smart enough. That the American promise of opportunity, while far more complicated than frontier mythology suggests, isn't entirely false. This is the story Laura tells in the Little House books, though she's telling it indirectly. The books end with these happy golden years in 1943, concluding with Laura's marriage and omitting the Dakota catastrophes that followed. The decision to stop there is deliberate. Publishers wanted happy ending, and Laura understood that readers didn't want to hear about crop failure and dead infants after spending 8 books rooting for the Ingalls family. But the first 4 years, published posthumously in 1971, reveals some of what followed. Drought, illness, loss. It's incomplete though. It stops before Florida, before the accumulation of the $100, before Missouri. It's tragedy without redemption. The redemption, Rocky Ridge, the farm, the success, remains mostly unwritten in Laura's published work. Perhaps that's appropriate. The farm years were work years, building years, the decades of daily labour that don't make compelling narrative because they're repetitive and gradual rather than dramatic. Clear a field, plant trees, wait 7 years, manage chickens, make butter, expand gradually. It's successful but not exciting. It's achievement but not adventure. And perhaps Laura understood that her literary contribution wasn't to document her own success, but to preserve memory of a vanishing world, the prairie frontier of her childhood, the covered wagon migrations, the homesteading experience that shaped American identity, even as it failed most people who attempted it. By 1949, when Almanzo dies at 92, Laura has published 8 Little House books and become one of America's most beloved children's authors. She's 82, widowed, living alone in the farmhouse they built together. The farm continues operating on reduced scale, some acreage rented out, some maintained for personal use, the apple orchard producing smaller crops from aging trees. She lives another 8 years, dying in 1957 at 90, 3 days after her birthday. The farm passes to Rose, who maintains it but never lives there permanently. When Rose dies in 1968, she leaves the property to be preserved as a museum, a decision that ensures Rocky Ridge will exist not just as working farm, but as monument to her parents' achievement. Today, approximately 50,000 visitors annually walk the grounds of Rocky Ridge Farm. They tour the farmhouse Laura designed. They see Almanzo's hand-built furniture. They walk paths between limestone walls constructed from rocks Laura and Almanzo cleared. They see the museum that houses artifacts, manuscripts, the physical evidence of lives lived deliberately and well. Most visitors come because of the Little House books. They want to connect with Laura, the character who shaped how generations understand American frontier experience. What they find is something more complex, evidence of real people who experienced real catastrophe and real achievement, whose lives were simultaneously harder and more rewarding than literature can fully capture. The farm stands as testament to what's possible when desperation meets determination, when $100 meets 40 acres, when partnership between a partially disabled man and a woman who refused traditional limits creates something neither could build alone, when 7 years of waiting for apple trees to bear translates into 30 years of harvest, when failure in one place doesn't preclude success elsewhere. Rocky Ridge Farm, transformed from wilderness to working farm to museum, represents American agricultural history in miniature, the transition from frontier subsistence to commercial farming to heritage preservation. It's specific to the Wilders, but reflects broader patterns: settlement, struggle, success, memory. The limestone walls Laura and Almanzo built from cleared rock still stand. The apple orchard, replanted multiple times but tracing original layout, still produces fruit each fall. The 10-room farmhouse sits solid on its stone foundation, designed by a farmwife who understood that home is more than shelter. It's the physical embodiment of values, priorities, the life you're building. And in the study with windows facing east, where morning light still falls on the desk Almanzo built, Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote books that preserve a world that no longer exists while living in the farm she spent 40 years creating. The building and the writing are inseparable, both acts of making something from almost nothing, both testaments to what's achievable through sustained effort, both legacies that outlast the people who created them. From $100 and 40 acres in 1894 to 5 million Little House books sold annually over a century later, the story of Rocky Ridge Farm transcends simple success narrative. It's more complex, more human, more valuable than that. It's proof that when everything falls apart, rebuilding is possible. That when society says you're too old, too poor, too disabled to achieve anything significant, society might be wrong. That 40 acres of rocks can become home, and home can become legacy, and legacy can shape how a nation understands itself. Laura and Almanzo Wilder built more than a farm. They built evidence that the American promise, for all its complications and failures and exclusions, can sometimes actually deliver on its commitments to people who work hard enough, long enough, smart enough to outlast the catastrophes that destroy everyone else. That's the real story of Rocky Ridge Farm, and it's written in limestone walls, apple trees, and words that will endure as long as people need to believe that starting over is possible. But there's a question that's been sitting quietly at the foundation of this entire story, waiting for someone to notice it. A question so obvious that it's easy to overlook in the drama of clearing rocks and planting orchards, and building 10-room farmhouses from nothing. Where did the $100 come from? It sounds simple, almost trivial. $100, the seed money that purchased 40 acres of Missouri hillside in 1894 and started everything that followed. We've treated it as a given, as the starting point of the narrative. Laura and Almanzo arrived in Mansfield with $100. That's where the story begins. Except, it doesn't. Not really. Because $100 in 1894 wasn't pocket change. It was 2 to 3 months of wages for an able-bodied skilled worker. It was roughly 1/4 of an entire year's income for an average farm family. It was enough money to buy 40 acres of land, or to live modestly for 6 months, or to completely change the trajectory of a family's future. And Laura and Almanzo didn't have it lying around. They'd spent the previous 9 years losing everything, repeatedly. Dakota homestead failures, diphtheria that paralyzed Almanzo permanently, an unnamed infant son buried in Dakota soil, a house fire that destroyed most of their possessions. Complete financial collapse that forced them to abandon their land and move to Spring Valley, Minnesota, to live with Almanzo's parents. Then the Florida experiment, 18 months in Westville, Florida, attempting to establish themselves in a climate that might help Almanzo's health. That also failed. By 1892, when they returned to Smet, South Dakota, they had nothing. Less than nothing, actually, because they still carried debt from the Dakota years. They were in their mid-20s and late 30s, respectively, with a 6-year-old daughter, no land, no home of their own, and a partially disabled man who couldn't perform the heavy agricultural labour that was his primary marketable skill. So where did $100 come from? How does a broke, traumatised family with no resources accumulate that kind of capital in just 2 years? The answer isn't dramatic. There was no inheritance, no lottery, no wealthy relative who died and left the money. The answer is the kind that doesn't make inspiring stories because it's too ordinary, too grinding, too unglamorous to mythologize. Laura sowed. For 2 years, from 1892 when they returned to De Smet until July 17, 1894 when they left for Missouri, Laura Ingalls Wilder worked as a seamstress and dressmaker. She took in sewing from De Smet families who could afford to pay for alterations, new garments, mending, the endless textile work that kept households functioning in an era when almost nothing was mass-produced and disposable. She sat at a sewing machine or with needle and thread, hour after hour, day after day, transforming fabric into income. 50 cents for altering a dress, $1 for making a new shirt, $2 for complex work, a wedding dress, a tailored suit, something that required skill and precision, and hours of labour that left her hands cramping and her eyes strained from focusing on tiny stitches in inadequate light. Almanzo worked too, taking whatever jobs his disability permitted, hauling, light carpentry, odd jobs that didn't require sustained heavy labour. But his income was limited by what his body could do, and what his body could do was constrained by nerve damage that would never fully heal. Most of the $100 came from Laura's needle, from work that was considered women's work that was paid less than men's labour, that was performed in private spaces rather than public workshops. From labour that didn't build anything permanent or impressive, that produced garments that would wear out and be replaced, that left no monuments or lasting achievements. Just money, slowly accumulating. Penny by penny, dollar by dollar, through 24 months of sitting at a sewing machine in a town where they'd already failed, surrounded by reminders of everything they'd lost. This is the part of the story that doesn't get told often, because it's not dramatic. There are no disasters to overcome in the moment, just the grinding daily reality of being broke and working to not be broke anymore. There's no villain except circumstances. There's no climactic victory, just the quiet accumulation of enough money to try again somewhere else. But this is where the Rocky Ridge story actually begins. Not in the covered wagon arriving in Missouri with $100, not in the first rock cleared from 40 acres of hillside, not in the apple trees planted with faith that they'd bear fruit 7 years later. It begins in Smet, South Dakota, in 1892. It begins with a 25-year-old woman who'd lost an infant son, watched her husband become disabled, lived through house fire and crop failure, and the complete collapse of everything they'd tried to build. It begins with that woman deciding that she would sit at a sewing machine every day for 2 years, earning 50 cents or $1 at a time, because somewhere in the accumulation of small amounts was the possibility of starting over. The $100 that bought Rocky Ridge Farm wasn't a gift. It wasn't luck. It was 2 years of Laura's hands moving thread through fabric, creating value from skill, transforming labour into capital, with a patience that's almost incomprehensible. And here's what makes that story powerful. She didn't know it would work. When she started sewing in 1892, she had no guarantee that 2 years of work would produce enough money to matter. She had no assurance that even if they saved $100, Missouri would be different from Dakota or Florida. She had no proof that starting over was possible, or that the next attempt wouldn't end in the same failure as all the previous attempts. She just kept sewing, because what else could she do? Give up? Accept poverty and instability as permanent conditions? Let Rose grow up knowing nothing but failure? So she sewed. And Almanzo worked whatever jobs he could manage, and slowly, impossibly, over 2 years of daily labour that nobody was watching or celebrating or documenting for history, they accumulated $100. That's the price of a dream. Not in the metaphorical sense, not the emotional cost or the sacrifice or the abstract value of persistence. The literal, calculable, documented price, $100, earned through approximately 700 days of sewing and odd jobs in a town that represented everything they'd failed to achieve. Rocky Ridge Farm, the 200 acres, the 10-room farmhouse, the successful orchard and poultry operations, the literary legacy that would define how generations understood American frontier experience. All of it traces back to those 2 years of sewing in Smet. Without the seamstress work, there's no Missouri migration. Without Missouri, there's no Rocky Ridge. Without Rocky Ridge, there's no Missouri ruralist articles, no emergence as a writer, no Little House books. The entire chain of events that leads to Laura Ingalls Wilder becoming one of America's most beloved authors begins with needle and thread and the desperate mathematics of how many garments you need to alter to save $100, and almost nobody talks about it. Here's what's strange about how we remember Laura Ingalls Wilder. We know her as the little girl in the Little House books. We know her as the elderly author who wrote those books in her 60s and 70s. But we barely know her as the woman in between, the 25 to 45-year-old who was actually building the life that made everything else possible. The seamstress years from 1892 to 1894 are almost invisible in popular memory. The Rocky Ridge years from 1894 to 1912 exist mainly as epilogue, as the happy ending that came after the prairie childhood. The Missouri ruralist journalism career is a footnote. The partnership with Almanzo is simplified into supporting pioneer wife rather than co-architect of a complex agricultural operation. What we remember is Laura the child and Laura the author. What we miss is Laura the survivor, the woman who rebuilt after catastrophe, who worked jobs nobody celebrated, who made strategic decisions that shaped outcomes, who possessed agency and capability that the nostalgic pioneer mythology often erases. Consider what she actually did between ages 25 and 45. Worked as seamstress for 2 years to save migration money. Drove a wagon team 650 miles across 3 states. Cleared timber and rocks from land that most people would have abandoned as unworkable. Developed expertise in poultry management that made her a recognized authority. Managed complex household economy balancing multiple income streams. Designed and oversaw construction of a 10-room farmhouse. wrote and published approximately 100 articles on agricultural topics, built a farm operation worth $10,000 from a $100 stake. That's not supporting character work. That's protagonist-level achievement. And it happened during years we barely discuss because they don't fit neatly into either the pioneer childhood narrative or the literary legacy narrative. The seamstress years are particularly telling, because sewing wasn't Laura's passion or calling. She was capable at it. She'd learned as a child, as all frontier girls did, and she had the fine motor skills and patience it required. But it wasn't what she wanted to do with her life. It was survival work. It was the job available to a woman in a small Dakota town in the 1890s who needed to earn money and had limited options. Teaching would have paid better. Laura was certified and had taught before marriage. But teaching required mobility and stability she didn't have. She needed work she could do while caring for Rose, work she could fit around Almanzo's limited ability to provide income, work that didn't require capital investment they didn't possess. So she sewed, and in doing so, she did what millions of women have done throughout history. She took work that was available rather than desirable, that was undervalued rather than celebrated, that was invisible rather than public, and she transformed that invisible labour into visible results. $100 that became 40 acres, that became 200 acres, that became a legacy. This matters because it challenges the bootstrap mythology that treats success as inevitable result of hard work. Laura worked hard during the Dakota years too. She worked hard in Florida. Hard work didn't save those ventures because hard work isn't enough when external conditions, weather, markets, health, timing, don't cooperate. The seamstress years worked not because Laura worked harder than she had before, but because the work was adapted to their specific constraints. It didn't require Almanzo's physical capability. It didn't depend on weather or crop success. It generated steady, predictable income in small increments that could be saved. It was work they could sustain for 2 years without catastrophic failure. This is the strategic thinking that popular accounts often miss. Laura wasn't just persistently working, she was adaptively working, choosing labour that matched available capacity, accumulating capital through method that minimised risk. The seamstress years were successful, not because Laura was exceptionally virtuous or hard-working, but because she was strategically realistic about what was achievable. And then she stopped. Once they had $100, she left the sewing machine behind. The work had served its purpose. It generated migration capital, and she moved on to different labour that the new location required. This isn't romantic persistence for its own sake. This is pragmatic adaptation to changing circumstances. The Rocky Ridge years show the same pattern. Laura didn't stick with one approach regardless of results. When subsistence farming was necessary, she did subsistence farming. When commercial poultry became viable, she developed commercial poultry expertise. When farm journalism created opportunities, she became a farm journalist. When the farm could operate with less labour, she transitioned to writing books. This adaptive flexibility is the real lesson of Laura's adult life. Not that hard work always succeeds, but that successful work adapts to conditions. Not that persistence alone is sufficient, but that persistence combined with strategic adjustment to changing circumstances can eventually produce results. The woman behind the myth is more interesting than the myth itself. She's not the idealized prairie girl frozen in childhood innocence. She's not the saintly pioneer wife supporting her husband's vision. She's a real person who experienced trauma and loss and failure, who worked on glamorous jobs to accumulate capital, who made strategic decisions about labour and investment, who adapted to disability and economic crisis and regional relocation, who built something significant through decades of daily choices. And she started by sewing, for 2 years, in a town where she'd already failed, earning money 50 cents at a time, saving it with discipline that's almost unimaginable. Refusing to accept that the catastrophes of the past 9 years defined her future. That's the woman who built Rocky Ridge Farm, not the little girl in the big woods, not the elderly author writing memoirs, the woman in between, invisible in popular memory, essential to everything that followed. We've spent 6 chapters exploring how Laura and Almanzo Wilder transformed $100 and 40 acres into Rocky Ridge Farm. 200 acres of productive land, a 10-room farmhouse, a legacy that shaped American understanding of frontier experience. We've traced 18 years of labour, from log cabin to limestone foundation, from subsistence poverty to commercial success. But we started the story in the middle. We began in August 1894 with a covered wagon arriving in Mansfield, Missouri, carrying a family with $100 and one last chance. We treated that as the beginning. It wasn't. The real beginning is 2 years earlier, in the late summer of 1892. Laura is 25 years old. Almanzo is 35. They've just returned to Smet, South Dakota, the same town where they'd failed spectacularly 5 years earlier. They're living temporarily, staying with friends or family, because they don't have a home of their own. They have no land, no savings, debt from the Dakota years still hanging over them, a 6-year-old daughter who's never known stability, and they have a plan, vague, desperate, barely formed, to try again somewhere else, somewhere that isn't Dakota, where wheat farming destroyed them, somewhere that isn't Florida, where the climate experiment failed, somewhere new where maybe, possibly, things could be different. But they need money. They need enough to relocate, to make a down payment on land, to survive the first season while establishing themselves. They need specifically $100. In 1892 in Smet, South Dakota, for a disabled farmer and his wife with no assets and limited prospects, $100 might as well be $1,000. The gap between 0 and 100 feels insurmountable. It represents months or years of disciplined saving, of earning small amounts and spending nothing, of living at the absolute edge of subsistence while gradually accumulating capital. And yet, they do it. Somehow, between late 1892 and July 1894, approximately 22 months, Laura and Almanzo save $100, the money that will buy Rocky Ridge. The money that will change everything. How? That's the question we haven't answered. We've documented what they did with the money. We haven't explored how they got it. The historical record is sparse. Laura's published writings barely mention this period. The Little House books end with her marriage in 1885. The first 4 years covers the catastrophic early marriage period through approximately 1889. Then there's a gap. Pioneer Girl, Laura's unpublished autobiography, touches on these years but doesn't detail the daily economics of survival. What we know is fragmentary. Laura worked as a seamstress and dressmaker in Smet from late 1892 through mid-1894. Almanzo took whatever work his disability permitted, hauling, light carpentry, odd jobs. They lived frugally, spending almost nothing beyond basic survival needs. They saved methodically, accumulating the $100 over approximately 22 to 24 months. The work was grinding, unglamorous, performed in obscurity with no guarantee of success. But the details, the daily reality of those 2 years, the specific hardships and small victories, the emotional weight of returning to a place of failure and working your way toward another attempt, those details exist mostly in absence. We know the outcome. We don't know the process. What was it like to be Laura Ingalls Wilder in December 1893, sitting at a sewing machine in a South Dakota winter, making 50 cents for altering a dress, knowing that at this rate it will take months more to save enough to leave? What did she think about during those hours of repetitive labour? Did she doubt the plan? Did she resent the circumstances that forced her into work she didn't choose? Did she fear that even if they saved the money, Missouri would fail just like everything else had failed? What was it like to be Almanzo Wilder at 36 years old, partially disabled, watching his wife earn most of the money that would fund their next attempt, because his body couldn't perform the labour that had always defined his identity? How did that feel, in an era when masculine worth was tied to physical capability and economic provision? Did it damage their relationship? Or did it create the unusual partnership that would characterize their Missouri years? What was it like to be Rose Wilder, ages 6 to 8 during these years, watching her parents struggle in a town where everyone knew they'd failed, attending school with children whose families were stable while hers remained precarious. How did those years shape her? Did they drive her later ambition, her determination to escape rural poverty, her complicated relationship with the farm her parents would eventually build? These questions don't have documented answers, but they have implications, because the seamstress years weren't just practical preparation for the Missouri migration, they were psychological crucible. They were the period when Laura and Almanzo had to decide whether to try again after catastrophic failure, whether to believe that starting over was possible, whether to invest 2 years of labour in an uncertain future. The decision to start sewing in 1892 was the decision that made Rocky Ridge possible. Every day Laura chose to continue that work, to take in another dress, to alter another garment, to earn another dollar was a small act of faith that the accumulation would eventually matter. Every day Almanzo chose to work within his limitations rather than give up, because his body couldn't do what it once could, was a small act of persistence that kept the family moving forward. And they did this in obscurity. Nobody was watching. Nobody was documenting their struggle for posterity. They weren't pioneers in the romantic sense. They were broke people in a small town, working low-status jobs, trying to save enough money to leave. If they'd failed, if they'd never accumulated the $100, or if Missouri had failed like Dakota and Florida, nobody would remember them. There would be no Rocky Ridge Farm, no museum, no Little House books, no American icon. The seamstress years are the hinge point where the story could have ended differently, where giving up would have been rational, understandable, perhaps even wise, where continuing was an act of either faith or desperation or stubborn refusal to accept that the catastrophes of the past defined the future. Laura chose to keep sewing, and in that choice repeated daily for 2 years, in a small Dakota town, earning money 50 cents at a time, she built the foundation for everything that followed. That's the story we haven't told, the story before Rocky Ridge. The story of how you accumulate $100 when you have nothing. The story of returning to the place you failed and working your way toward another chance. The story of labor that nobody celebrates, that leaves no monuments, that exists only in the quiet accumulation of capital through discipline that's almost superhuman. It's not as dramatic as clearing Ozark timber. It's not as triumphant as watching apple trees finally bear fruit. It's not as beautiful as a 10-room farmhouse with stone foundation and oak floors. But it's where everything begins, in a small room in Smet, South Dakota, with a sewing machine and fabric, and a woman who refused to stop trying, with the mathematics of how many garments you need to alter to save $100, with the daily choice to believe that somewhere, somehow, starting over was still possible. That's the story nobody tells, but it's the story that explains everything else. Next time, we're going back to those 2 forgotten years, to the seamstress work that built a dream, to the woman sitting at a sewing machine in 1892 stitching her way toward Missouri, one dress at a time, to the untold story of how Laura Ingalls Wilder saved her family's future, 50 cents at a time. Because before there was Rocky Ridge Farm, there was a needle and thread, and a woman who wouldn't quit.